Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The question matters because Lovecraft's fictional cults operated according to specific temporal and geographic coordinates, stellar alignments, coastal isolation, particular hours when barriers between dimensions grew thin. Understanding when and where you encounter this material places you, however symbolically, within the same investigative framework that doomed so many of Lovecraft's protagonists. Between 1917 and 1936, H.P. Lovecraft constructed the most comprehensive taxonomy of fictional religious devotion in American literature. His cults weren't mere plot devices, but fully realized theological systems complete with hierarchies, ritual practices, material incentives, and catastrophic consequences for practitioners. The esoteric order of Dagon transformed an entire Massachusetts seaport into breeding ground for amphibious hybrids. The Cthulhu cults spanned continents and centuries, coordinating worship through dreams sent by sleeping God. The Starry Wisdom sect in Providence wielded artifacts permitting vision into cosmic gulfs that destroyed observers' sanity. This investigation catalogs Lovecraft's complete cult ecosystem, examining their historical development, philosophical underpinnings, ritual practices, and disturbing persistence in contemporary culture. We'll trace how these organizations evolved from simple literary antagonists into complex examinations of why humans worship entities that regard worshippers with absolute indifference. We'll confront the suppressed cult whose practices Lovecraft found too transgressive to fully describe, exploring what religious activities exceeded even cosmic horror's generous boundaries. What we're analyzing isn't merely fictional villainy. These cults represent thought experiments about devotion without reciprocity, knowledge that destroys seekers, and the possibility that religious impulse itself, the human need to worship something greater, might constitute cosmic-scale vulnerability, exploitable by forces utterly indifferent to human survival. By investigating these cults, you've already joined their study. The question is whether you'll recognize the moment when study becomes participation. Howard Phillips. Lovecraft approached cult creation with deliberate philosophical precision, inverting every comforting aspect of conventional religion to produce organizations that offer material benefits while guaranteeing spiritual annihilation. His letters from the 1920s and 1930s reveal sophisticated understanding of religious psychology, despite, or perhaps because of, his militant atheism and materialist philosophy. Where traditional religions promise salvation, cosmic purpose, and divine love, Lovecraft's cults deliver gold, extended lifespan, and cosmic knowledge in exchange for hereditary corruption, biological transformation, and eventual dissolution of human identity. This wasn't mere aesthetic choice, but systematic exploration of what worship becomes when directed toward entities fundamentally incapable of reciprocating devotion or even acknowledging worshippers' existence. Lovecraft's personal relationship with religion shaped his cult depictions profoundly. Raised in declining Providence gentry, he absorbed his family's contempt for enthusiastic religion while developing fascination with religious rituals' psychological power. His 1922 essay, A Confession of Unfaith, articulates thoroughgoing materialism. Consciousness emerges from matter, ceases at death, and possesses no cosmic significance. Yet his fiction obsessively returns to religious devotion, suggesting that even convinced atheists recognized worship as fundamental human behavior, requiring explanation. The cults became laboratory for investigating why humans persist in devotional practices, even when, especially when, those practices serve nothing but their own continuation. This paradox drives every cult narrative. Worshippers pursuing communion with powers that regard them as insects, regard microorganisms with less awareness and infinitely less concern. The evolution of Lovecraft's cult depictions tracks his growing sophistication as writer and thinker between 1917 and 1937. Dagon presents cult worship as exotic background detail, vague references to degenerate Pacific Islanders performing unspecified rites. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, develops worldwide conspiracy of coordinated worship, different cultures independently arriving at same devotional practices through dream contact with sleeping entity. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, provides microscopic examination of complete cult ecosystem, recruitment, hierarchy, transformation, material incentives, biological consequences, functioning as sociological study, disguised as horror narrative. By The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, cults leave archaeological traces requiring historical reconstruction, with the Starry Wisdom Sect's 1844-1877 activity documented through fragmentary records and disturbing artifacts. This progression demonstrates Lovecraft treating cults with increasing seriousness as vehicles for exploring consciousness, heredity, and what he considered civilization's fragility against forces both cosmic and biological. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft positioned cults as intermediaries between cosmic entities and human civilization, necessary translation mechanisms for beings whose nature exceeds direct human comprehension. The entities themselves, Cthulhu, Dagon, Nyarlathotep, cannot or will not communicate directly with individual humans in ways preserving sanity. Cults provide organizational framework, allowing sustained interaction while distributing psychological costs across population, rather than concentrating them in single consciousness. This makes cults simultaneously protective and parasitic, buffering individuals from direct cosmic contact, while ensuring entire communities become infected with knowledge that conventional society cannot accommodate. The cult structure emerges as evolutionary adaptation, allowing dangerous information to persist and propagate without immediately destroying every host it occupies. The role of cults in Lovecraft's fiction extends beyond simple antagonist function to interrogate religion's relationship to truth and madness. His materialist philosophy insisted that all religion represents superstitious error, yet his fictional cults worship entities that demonstrably exist within story logic. This creates disturbing implication. What if the most apparently irrational religious practices, human sacrifice, ritual chanting, worship of monstrous idols, prove accurate responses to actual cosmic realities that rational civilization refuses to acknowledge? The cultists aren't deluded, but perceiving truths that sanity requires ignoring, making their apparent madness actually superior epistemological position. This inversion haunts every cult narrative, forcing readers to confront possibility that civilization's comfortable assumptions about reality's nature might be precisely wrong in ways that primitive or degenerate worship correctly apprehends. The suppressed cult threading through Lovecraft's work exists primarily through absence and fragmentary reference. Practices too transgressive for explicit description, even in fiction that routinely depicted human sacrifice, cannibalism, and sexual congress with inhuman entities. References appear in unpublished letters, in passages, weird tales. Editor Farnsworth Wright requested Lovecraft remove. In story concepts, he abandoned mid-development. What religious practices exceeded boundaries of 1920s, 1930s pulp horror? What worship activities proved too disturbing to document even obliquely? This mystery suggests that Lovecraft recognized limits to cosmic horror's transgression, that some cult behaviors would transform philosophical investigation into exploitation, or that certain implications of his own materialist theology led to conclusions he found genuinely intolerable, despite spending career exploring intolerable ideas. Understanding Lovecraft's explicit cults requires first acknowledging what he systematically refused to make explicit, and asking what that refusal reveals about cosmic horror's ethical and philosophical boundaries. Ancient mystery cults provided structural template for Lovecraft's fictional organizations, particularly their emphasis on secret knowledge accessible only through initiation and their promise of transformation unavailable to uninitiated masses. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, the Orphic cults, and Mithric traditions all employed graduated revelation. New initiates received partial truths, while higher degrees accessed increasingly esoteric teachings. Lovecraft inverted this pedagogical structure. His cults promise cosmic knowledge, but deliver progressive madness, each revelation destroying rather than elevating the recipient. Where mystery religions used staged initiations to create psychological transformation, preparing adherents for mystical experience, Lovecraft's cults employ similar staging to ensure adherents cannot retreat once they've witnessed enough to make retreat psychologically impossible. The architecture remains identical, while the outcome reverses completely. Ancient mysteries aimed at apotheosis, Lovecraftian mysteries guarantee dissolution. Theosophy and the late 19th century occult revival saturated Lovecraft's cultural environment, despite his personal contempt for what he considered charlatanism and wishful thinking. Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and various spiritualist movements popularized ideas about hidden masters, secret wisdom preserved by initiated adepts, and hierarchical access to cosmic truth. These movements attracted educated middle-class adherents seeking alternatives to both Orthodox Christianity and scientific materialism, creating organizational models combining religious devotion with quasi-scientific investigation. Lovecraft absorbed this cultural atmosphere while systematically corrupting its optimistic assumptions. His cults maintain the hierarchical structure, the emphasis on hidden knowledge, and the promise of contact with superior intelligences. But the hidden knowledge destroys minds that acquire it, and the superior intelligences regard human consciousness with less interest than humans show toward intestinal parasites. The anthropological concept of primitive religion accessing genuine cosmic forces rather than mere superstition threads dangerously through Lovecraft's work, reflecting both contemporary anthropological thought and his own virulent racism. Early 20th century anthropology, particularly James Frazer's The Golden Bough, 1890, documented ritual practices across cultures while often interpreting non-Western religions as evolutionary holdovers from humanity's savage past. Lovecraft weaponized this framework. His cults frequently involve degenerate mixed-race populations, isolated communities resistant to modern civilization, and non-Western peoples whose religious practices supposedly preserved knowledge that white Western rationalism has lost. This represents cosmic horror's most ethically compromised element. Lovecraft consistently associated cosmic truth with racial and cultural others, suggesting that deviation from Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms correlates with susceptibility to or awareness of cosmic horrors. The cults become vehicles for expressing xenophobic anxiety, while simultaneously suggesting that the xenophobia itself might be a defensive response to genuine threats that cultural others recognize more clearly than the civilized observer. Secret society panic in late 19th and early 20th century America provided immediate cultural context for Lovecraft's cult conspiracies. Fears about Freemasons, Illuminati, Catholic infiltration, and immigrant anarchist cells circulated widely, producing narratives where hidden organizations pursued agendas incompatible with American democratic values. The 1826 disappearance of William Morgan after threatening to expose Masonic secrets sparked decades of anti-Masonic political organizing. The influx of Catholic immigrants generated conspiracy theories about papal plots to undermine Protestant America. Jewish populations faced accusations of international banking conspiracies. Lovecraft absorbed and transformed these xenophobic conspiracy narratives, replacing specific ethnic or religious targets with cults serving genuinely alien entities. This substitution performs complex ideological work. It validates conspiracy thinking's structure. Hidden organizations do threaten civilization, while universalizing the threat beyond any specific human population, suggesting that any group, any race, any class, any nationality might harbor cult activity because cosmic entities don't discriminate in their indifferent corruption. Decadent literature's exploration of transgressive spirituality, particularly Joris Karl Huysmans' Laba, 1891, with its detailed black mass descriptions, demonstrated that late 19th century fiction could examine religious transgression with quasi-documentary precision. Huysmans documented satanic ritual practices, sexual magic, and inverted Christianity, with ethnographic attention that influenced Lovecraft's approach to cult description. But where Huysmans' black masses operated within Christian cosmology, rebellious worship still acknowledging the Christian God even through inversion, Lovecraft's cults worship entities completely outside Christian metaphysics. His cultists don't rebel against established religion. They practice devotions that Christian categories cannot accommodate because the entities receiving worship exist in dimensional and temporal frameworks where Christian distinctions between good and evil, sacred and profane, carry no meaning whatsoever. New England witch trial history provided geographically immediate precedent for hidden cults operating within American landscape, transforming Puritan anxieties into cosmic horror's raw material. The Salem trials of 1692-1693 established cultural memory of secret devil worship in New England communities, of covenants signed in blood, of gatherings in remote locations where initiates performed acts they couldn't later coherently describe. Lovecraft mined this history extensively, particularly in The Dreams in the Witch House, where Keziah Mason's 1692 escape from Salem jail connects historical witchcraft to cosmic entity worship. The witch trials demonstrated that American communities could convince themselves that neighbors practiced secret abominations, that ordinary New Englanders could confess to impossible crimes under sufficient pressure, and that religious panic could transform familiar landscape into territory, harboring genuine evil. Lovecraft secularized these dynamics while maintaining their essential structure. Replace the Christian devil with Nyarlathotep. Replace theological corruption with biological transformation, and the pattern persists. Hidden worship in ordinary communities, practices that exceed articulation, and consequences that validate the paranoid assumption that something terrible indeed operates beneath civilization's surface, though not remotely what witch hunters imagined they were opposing. Lovecraft's cult naming conventions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how titles convey legitimacy, while suggesting hidden knowledge accessible only to initiates. The esoteric order of Dagon combines quasi-Masonic organizational language, order, with occult terminology, esoteric, and biblical reference. Dagon, Philistine deity mentioned in 1 Samuel, creating impression of ancient lineage and secret tradition. The Starry Wisdom sect employs astronomical imagery, suggesting cosmic rather than terrestrial concerns, while wisdom promises knowledge unavailable through conventional channels. The cult of Cthulhu uses the loaded term cult self-consciously, the organization's members presumably not considering themselves cultists, but devotees of genuine cosmic truth. These naming patterns borrow prestige from established religious and fraternal organizations, while signaling transgression through exotic or unsettling elements, a combination that makes the cults simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable as religious organizations while operating according to principles conventional religion cannot accommodate. Ritual language in Lovecraft's cults serves multiple simultaneous functions, establishing atmospheric alienness, suggesting knowledge beyond human linguistic capacity, and raising questions about whether incomprehensible sounds constitute actual communication or mere phonetic approximation. The famous Cthulhu chant, Fringlui Maglunaf, Cthulhu Gurulia Ugahanago Ftang, supposedly translates as, "In his house at Rulia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming," but the English rendering feels inadequate to the grotesque consonant clusters of the original. This inadequacy proves functionally important. If cosmic entities exist outside human, evolutionary, and linguistic frameworks, then human language should struggle to represent their names, locations, and nature. The cultists' chants become attempts to produce sounds that human vocal apparatus wasn't designed to make, forcing throat and tongue into configurations that approach, but never quite achieve, proper pronunciation. The ritual language thus embodies the central cult paradox. Humans attempting to communicate with entities that communication cannot reach, using words that aren't quite words to address beings for whom human language represents meaningless noise. Symbolic objects function as physical manifestations of cult theology while providing tangible evidence of otherwise invisible devotional practices. The shining trapezohedron of the Starry Wisdom sect permits vision into cosmic gulfs, technological artifact rather than mere religious icon, suggesting that cult worship involves actual perceptual expansion rather than symbolic representation. Strange idols appear across cult narratives. The Cthulhu statuette that Inspector Legras seizes combines octopus, dragon, and human caricature in ways that violate artistic and biological categories simultaneously. These objects aren't created through normal sculptural techniques, but through processes the stories never fully explain, hinting at either alien manufacture or human craftsmanship, guided by visions that exceed normal aesthetic sensibilities. The idols serve practical function. They provide portable representations of entities too vast or dimensionally complex to perceive directly, allowing cultists to maintain devotional focus on beings whose actual appearance would destroy observers' sanity. Architecture of worship in Lovecraft's cults ranges from repurposed existing structures to impossibly ancient constructions predating human civilization. The Starry Wisdom sect occupied an abandoned Free Will Baptist church in Providence, transforming conventional religious architecture to heterodox purposes, a pattern suggesting that cult worship can infiltrate and corrupt established religious spaces. The Deep One Temple in Ihanthle, beneath Devil Reef, employs non-Euclidean geometry, architecture that appears simultaneously vast and cramped depending on viewing angle, suggesting spaces designed for beings whose relationship to three-dimensional space differs fundamentally from human spatial experience. Remote locations, Louisiana swamps, Pacific islands, Antarctic wastes frequently house cult activity, isolation serving both practical function, avoiding detection, and theological purpose. Proximity to places where dimensional barriers thin and cosmic entities more easily manifest. The cult architecture thus ranges from opportunistic appropriation of human structures to discovery of pre-human sites whose very geometry proves hostile to human perception. Cult hierarchies in Lovecraft's work typically organize around degrees of transformation rather than purely administrative structure. The esoteric order of Dagon demonstrates this clearly. The Marsh family leadership possesses greatest degree of Deep One ancestry and furthest progression toward amphibious transformation, making biological change correlate with religious authority. Lower-ranking cultists remain more human in appearance and behavior, while highest initiates have largely completed transformation into non-human form. This creates a hierarchical system where advancement literally means becoming less human, where religious promotion equals biological corruption, and where the most devoted adherents can no longer pass for ordinary humans in conventional society. Other cults employ more conventional hierarchies, priests, initiates, novices, but even these typically involve graduated revelation where higher ranks access increasingly dangerous knowledge that lower ranks are protected from encountering until deemed psychologically prepared or sufficiently corrupted to withstand it. The distinction between worship and transaction defines Lovecraft's cult's theological sophistication. Traditional religions frame devotion as love, awe, or reverence directed toward divine beings who reciprocate through grace, salvation, or cosmic purpose. Lovecraft's cultists engage in something more pragmatic and disturbing. They perform services for entities that might notice those services enough to provide material benefits while remaining fundamentally indifferent to the servitor's existence. The esoteric order of Dagon receives gold and abundant fishing in exchange for human sacrifice and breeding programs. This isn't worship in conventional sense, but negotiated arrangement, contract between parties with asymmetric power and utterly incompatible natures. The cultists don't love Dagon or the Deep Ones. They exploit the entity's willingness to trade resources for specific human actions while understanding that the entities regard humans as humans regard livestock, potentially useful but possessing no inherent value beyond utility. This transactional framing strips religious devotion of every comforting element while preserving its organizational forms, creating structures that look like churches but function like particularly horrifying businesses, negotiating with partners who might casually annihilate them without malice or even awareness. Geographic naming in cult contexts, Aralia, Yihantle, Irem, Leng, creates sacred geography existing parallel to conventional maps, places that occupy physical coordinates but operate according to different dimensional principles. Rulier's coordinates appear in The Call of Cthulhu with nautical precision, 47 degree 9s, 126 to 43 W in the South Pacific, suggesting locatable reality. Yet the city's non-Euclidean geometry makes simple location inadequate description. Yihantle exists beneath Devil Reef, off Innsmouth's coast, accessible through underwater passages, yet somehow containing architecture and spaces that shouldn't physically fit beneath observable reef structure. These locations function as cosmic embassies where normal physical laws apply imperfectly, where entities from outside conventional dimensions maintain presence in Earth's spatial framework, and where cultists can achieve proximity to beings whose full manifestation in normal space would prove catastrophic. The geographic specificity lends false comfort. We can map these places, assign them coordinates, while the actual nature of what exists at those coordinates defies cartographic representation. Lovecraft constructed fictional cult histories with quasi-historical precision, providing founding dates, organizational development timelines, and documentary evidence that makes invented traditions feel archaeologically verifiable. The Starry Wisdom sect's history spans 1844 to 1877, with Professor Enoch Bowen founding the organization after acquiring the shining trapezohedron during Egyptian travels, establishing Providence chapter that operated for 33 years before public pressure forced dissolution. This specificity, exact years, named founder, documented suppression, mimics how actual religious movements get recorded in historical archives. The esoteric order of Dagon traces to Captain Obed Marsh's 1838 encounters with Pacific Island cults, his 1840s introduction of hybrid breeding to Innsmouth, and the town's subsequent economic boom and biological transformation across generations. These detailed chronologies create false paper trails that readers can mentally cross-reference, building impression that Lovecraft documented actual, suppressed history rather than inventing fiction whole cloth. Cross-story validation elevates individual cult references into systematic mythology through accumulated corroboration. The Call of Cthulhu describes worldwide Cthulhu worship through Inspector Legrasse's 1907 Louisiana raid, and separately through 1925 dream epidemic affecting sensitive individuals globally. The Dunwich Horror references both the Necronomicon and other grimoires describing similar entities and worship practices, suggesting multiple independent textual sources document the same phenomena. The Shadow over Innsmouth confirms that Deep One worship exists not just in Massachusetts, but across Pacific Islands, and presumably anywhere humans and amphibious entities coexist. Each story treats previously introduced cults as established fact, requiring no re-explanation, technique that makes later stories feel like they're exploring already documented reality rather than introducing new inventions. The cumulative effect produces mythology that appears to pre-exist any single narrative, as if Lovecraft were merely selecting particular cult activities to spotlight rather than creating the cults through the act of description. Pseudo-anthropological documentation distances narrator from cult activities while lending scholarly legitimacy to descriptions of transgressive practices. The Call of Cthulhu presents cult information through Professor Angel's academic research, Inspector Legrasse's police report, and Norwegian sailors' testimony, multiple evidentiary layers that readers must assemble into coherent picture. This documentary approach permits detailed description of human sacrifice, cannibalistic feasts, and sexual rituals, while maintaining narrators' horrified distance from activities described. The scholars and investigators recording cult practices aren't participants, but observers. Their academic or legal authority supposedly guaranteeing objective reportage, even as the reported activities exceed rational explanation. This creates productive tension. The narrative voice insists on scholarly detachment while describing events that should shatter any detached perspective, suggesting that the narrators maintain rationality through willful incomprehension of what their own documentation reveals. The collaborative expansion through other writers added cult variations that Lovecraft would subsequently reference, creating false impression of ancient established tradition that multiple scholars independently researched. Clark Ashton Smith contributed Tsathoggua worship centered in prehistoric Hyperborea, and Lovecraft incorporated references to Tsathoggua cults into his own work. Robert Bloch developed the starry wisdom sects practices in greater detail than Lovecraft's original stories provided, and Lovecraft accepted Bloch's additions as canonical. This collaborative approach meant that by Lovecraft's death in 1937, cult mythology existed in distributed form across dozens of stories by multiple authors, no single narrative providing complete picture, but accumulated texts suggesting vast suppressed history of deviant worship spanning continents and millennia. The technique exploited readers' tendency to synthesize information across sources, creating coherent mythology from deliberately fragmentary presentations. Fragmentary revelation serves both practical and philosophical functions in cult documentation. Practically, incomplete information permits writers to suggest transgressive practices without explicit description that might provoke censorship or reader revolt. Philosophically, gaps in knowledge mirror how actual historical research works. Ancient cult activities survive only through hostile accounts, fragmentary artifacts, and practices that participants deliberately concealed. Lovecraft's narrators frequently discover partial records, cult documents destroyed by authorities, testimony from witnesses who died or went mad before completing accounts, artifacts whose purpose investigators can only speculate about. The Starry Wisdom sect left the shining trapezohedron and fragmentary records of their observations, but complete liturgy and theological framework remain lost. The esoteric order of Dagon maintains some traditions openly while concealing the hybrid breeding program's full extent until Robert Olmsted's investigation force's revelation. These gaps aren't authorial failure, but deliberate strategy, ensuring that complete understanding remains perpetually out of reach, that accumulating knowledge about cults produces more questions than answers. Real locations housing fictional cults ground cosmic horror in verifiable geography while transforming familiar American landscape into territory harboring incomprehensible threats. Lovecraft's Providence, Arkham, based on Salem, and Innsmouth, inspired by various declining New England seaports, occupy specific positions in Massachusetts geography, accessible by documented roads and railways. Readers familiar with new
and memorizing cycles. This information was sacred, not because it was mystical, but because it was powerful. Timekeeping meant control over ritual. Ritual meant access to eternity. By placing this knowledge inside coffins, the Egyptians ensured that the dead carried it with them. The coffin became more than a container for the body. It became a vehicle, a map, and a protective structure all at once. Not all coffins contain star maps. Their presence often correlates with status and period. During the Middle Kingdom, this practice became more widespread, extending beyond kings to high officials and elites. This shift reflects a democratization of the afterlife, where cosmic knowledge was no longer reserved solely for royalty, yet the knowledge was still restricted. The maps were never displayed openly in temples or public spaces. They were hidden inside coffins, sealed away forever. The living were not meant to study them. Only the dead needed them. This secrecy tells us something important about Egyptian belief. The afterlife was not vague or abstract. It was structured, timed, and navigable. The Egyptians believed that survival after death depended on preparation, knowledge, and alignment with cosmic order. The stars provided that order. Some coffins even include texts that refer directly to becoming a star. The deceased hoped to join the imperishable ones, the circumpolar stars that never set and never die. These stars circled the north forever, symbolizing eternal existence. To become one of them was the ultimate goal. The star maps were guides toward that transformation. From a human perspective, there is something deeply moving about this practice. Someone took the time to paint the night sky inside a coffin, knowing it would never be seen again. The work was done with care, accuracy, and intention, even though no living eye would ever admire it. This was belief made tangible. It also reveals how closely science and spirituality were intertwined in ancient Egypt. Astronomy was not separate from religion. Observing the sky was a sacred act. Measuring time was a form of devotion. Understanding celestial cycles meant understanding divine order. Modern categories do not apply here. There was no division between science and belief. The star maps inside coffins represent one of the earliest known attempts to encode astronomical knowledge visually. They predate many later star charts and reflect an observational tradition that lasted for centuries. Yet for a long time they were misunderstood or dismissed as decoration. Only careful study revealed their purpose. The positioning of stars on coffin lids often aligns with the orientation of the tomb. The north-south axis mattered. The body was placed to mirror cosmic alignment. Everything was intentional. Even the act of sealing the coffin had meaning. Once closed, the star map was complete. The deceased was enclosed within the universe itself, wrapped in cosmic order. This
creates religion stripped of reciprocity. Cultists perform elaborate rituals, make costly sacrifices, transform their biology and society, all while serving entities that would not notice if every human cultist simultaneously ceased existing. The worship becomes purely transactional at best, purely delusional at worst, with no possibility of genuine communion, because communion requires mutual awareness that cosmic entities cannot provide. The futility of devotion raises disturbing question about why cultists persist in worship that cannot possibly achieve traditional religious goals. Lovecraft provides several answers across his fiction, none entirely compatible, all psychologically plausible. Some cultists seek material benefits. The esoteric order of Dagon receives gold, fish, extended lifespan, in exchange for services rendered to deep ones who find human offerings useful regardless of theological significance. Others pursue forbidden knowledge, treating cosmic entities as sources of information rather than objects of love or reverence. Still others embrace cosmic horror's central revelation, with something approaching religious fervor precisely because it eliminates human significance. Worship of utterly indifferent cosmos represents ultimate humility, absolute surrender of anthropocentric delusion. This third category proves most philosophically sophisticated. Cultists who recognize that meaning doesn't exist except as human projection, that purpose is fiction we impose on purposeless universe, yet who continue devotional practices as acknowledgement of and submission to cosmic truth that conventional society refuses to confront. Transactional religion replaces theological salvation with material compensation, transforming worship into something resembling contract negotiation with vastly more powerful party. The deep ones provide tangible benefits. Innsmouth's economic prosperity during decades when other fishing communities struggled, gold artifacts of obvious value, biological modifications extending lifespan and granting aquatic capabilities. These aren't spiritual rewards requiring faith to perceive, but empirically verifiable results that even skeptics must acknowledge. This creates disturbing inversion. Conventional religion demands faith in invisible rewards, salvation, afterlife, divine love, while providing no evidence, whereas Lovecraft's cults deliver observable material benefits while offering no spiritual consolation whatsoever. The cultists aren't deluded about receiving divine favor. They're pragmatic operators, exploiting cosmic entities' willingness to trade resources for human services. This strips religion of transcendent dimension while preserving its organizational forms, creating structures that function like corporations, negotiating with alien trading partners who happen to regard humans as livestock, but livestock capable of providing useful services worth compensating. Hereditary corruption operates as both theological principle and biological reality in Lovecraft's cult structures, with devotional practices producing genetic consequences that persist across generations. The Deep One hybrids demonstrate this most explicitly. Initial cultists breed with amphibious entities, producing offspring who appear human in youth, but gradually transform into fully aquatic form across decades. These children didn't choose cult membership, but inherited it through biology, their DNA ensuring eventual transformation regardless of personal beliefs or choices. This makes cult membership literally inescapable for descendants. You cannot apostatize from religion encoded in your genes, cannot reject theology that manifests through physical metamorphosis written into cellular structure. Other cults employ less explicit hereditary elements, but the pattern persists. Cult knowledge, susceptibility to cosmic influence, and biological vulnerability to entity contact all pass from parents to children, ensuring that cults perpetuate through bloodlines as much as through conversion. This represents Lovecraft's anxieties about heredity and degeneration achieving religious expression, suggesting that worship leaves permanent marks not just on practitioners, but on their descendants unto unspecified generations. Knowledge as curse rather than blessing inverts Enlightenment assumptions about information's intrinsic value while preserving religious structures around knowledge acquisition. The cults function as schools teaching cosmic truth, graduated curricula where initiates receive progressively more complete understanding of humanity's actual position in indifferent universe. But this knowledge doesn't empower, it destroys. Learning that consciousness is cosmic accident, that human values have no universal validity, that entities exist for whom our extinction would register as less significant than we regard the extinction of intestinal bacteria, produces psychological damage proportional to comprehension's completeness. The cultists who achieve deepest understanding suffer most severe madness or undergo most complete transformation away from humanity, suggesting that cosmic horror's ultimate revelation is literally unsustainable for minds evolved to maintain comforting fictions about meaning and purpose. The cults thus offer education that their students cannot survive completing, teaching truths that destroy the consciousness capable of learning them. The dissolution of self constitutes cult worship's ultimate consequence, and perhaps its actual purpose. Cultists don't merely serve cosmic entities, they become progressively less human through the service, transforming biologically, psychologically, and metaphysically until distinctions between worshipper and worshipped blur beyond recognition. The Deep One hybrids eventually abandon terrestrial life entirely, joining their amphibious kin in Yhanthley's depths. The starry wisdom cultists, who gazed too long through the shining trapezohedron, lost coherent selfhood, their consciousness fragmenting across dimensional gulfs that human neurology cannot navigate while maintaining identity. This suggests that cult worship ultimately seeks self-annihilation, that devotional practices aim at eliminating the human consciousness, experiencing devotion rather than elevating or preserving it. The cultist's goal becomes ceasing to exist as human individual, while perhaps achieving some incomprehensible existence as part of cosmic entities' diffuse awareness, a fate that conventional categories of life and death cannot adequately describe. Cosmic pessimism frames cult activity as preparation for inevitable apocalypse rather than prevention of catastrophe or pursuit of salvation. The Cthulhu cults don't worship to appease angry God or prevent cosmic disaster. They prepare for guaranteed event when stars align correctly and the great old ones return to reclaim Earth. Human civilization will end not because humanity failed morally or theologically, but because geology and astronomy eventually produce conditions permitting entities to manifest that human presence cannot survive. The cultists embrace this inevitability, positioning themselves as collaborators with unstoppable force rather than resisting futilely. This represents ultimate submission to deterministic universe, where human agency means nothing, where our choices might slightly accelerate or delay, but cannot prevent outcomes that cosmic timescales render inevitable. The cults become organizations dedicated to accepting truth, that hope is delusion, that resistance is meaningless, that the only rational response to cosmic horror is preparation for annihilation that no amount of struggle can forestall. The worship of Cthulhu demonstrates cosmic horror's most geographically distributed cult structure, with independent organizations across Pacific Islands, Louisiana bayous, Greenland settlements, and presumably countless other locations arriving at similar devotional practices through shared dream contact with the sleeping entity. The Call of Cthulhu documents this global coordination. During March 1925, sensitive individuals worldwide experienced identical dreams of great cyclopean cities, of titan blocks, and sky-flung monoliths, suggesting that Cthulhu's unconscious emanations reach across continents simultaneously. The cultists don't communicate through conventional channels, but receive synchronized transmissions directly from Aurelia, making their worship genuinely independent, yet mysteriously coordinated. Inspector Legrasse's 1907 raid on Louisiana swamp cult captured worshippers chanting Fing Louis, Magruanaf, Cthulhu, Relais, Ugahnagoftung, while Greenland communities, thousands of miles away, employed phonetically identical invocations, suggesting either that the chant represents actual communication in Cthulhu's language, or that human vocal apparatus, when influenced by the entity's dreams, spontaneously produces similar sounds across cultures. The worship practices center on cyclic rituals coordinated with astronomical events that cultists claim will eventually produce conditions permitting Cthulhu's full awakening. The cults track stellar positions, oceanic conditions, and geological shifts, maintaining calendars measuring time in scales where human lifespans represent rounding errors. Their theology posits that when the stars are right, Relaya will rise from Pacific depths, and Cthulhu will emerge to teach humanity new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, a promise that conventional morality would interpret as apocalyptic threat, but that cultists embrace as liberation from civilization's constraints. The rituals themselves involve human sacrifice, orgiastic celebrations, and creation of Cthulhu idols, combining octopoid, draconic, and vaguely anthropoid features, artistic representations that witnesses describe as simultaneously repulsive and hypnotic, suggesting the images capture something true about the entity's nature that human aesthetics evolved to find disturbing. The esoteric order of Dagon represents Lovecraft's most completely documented cult ecosystem, with the shadow over Innsmouth providing microscopic examination of how economic desperation transforms into religious devotion, producing biological transformation across generations. Captain Obed Marsh founded the organization after 1830 encounters with Pacific Islanders who worshipped fish-like entities and prospered through their devotion. Marsh imported these practices to declining Innsmouth in the 1840s, establishing covenant with deep ones dwelling beneath Devil Reef. The amphibious beings would provide gold and ensure abundant fishing in exchange for human sacrifices and interbreeding that would gradually transform Innsmouth's population into amphibious hybrids capable of joining the deep ones in their underwater city, Yahantle. The cult hierarchy correlates directly with degree of transformation, making biological change visible marker of religious advancement. The Marsh family, possessing greatest deep one ancestry, exhibits most pronounced physical alterations: bulging eyes, rough scaly skin, gill-like structures on neck, webbed fingers, while maintaining sufficient human appearance to conduct surface business. Lower-ranking cultists show minimal changes in youth, but undergo progressive metamorphosis across decades, eventually developing fully amphibious capabilities and abandoning terrestrial existence entirely. This creates a situation where cult membership becomes literally inescapable. Those with deep one blood will transform regardless of personal beliefs, their biology ensuring religious destiny independent of theological conviction. Robert Olmsted's discovery of his own Marsh ancestry at Story's conclusion demonstrates that cult corruption persists even in descendants who fled Innsmouth, their genes guaranteeing eventual transformation that geographic distance cannot prevent. The material benefits prove sufficient to maintain cult, despite biological consequences that should inspire horror. Innsmouth experienced economic boom during decades when neighboring ports declined, its fishing fleet consistently returning with full holds while others struggled. The gold artifacts provided by Deep Ones funded town infrastructure and personal enrichment. Extended lifespans granted initiated members decades beyond normal human expectancy. These tangible rewards make the cult's bargain calculable: sacrifice human form and eventually abandon terrestrial life in exchange for prosperity, longevity, and membership in civilization predating humanity by millions of years. The transaction appears grotesque from outside, but perhaps rational from within. Why maintain purely human form when hybrid existence offers material advantages and access to Ihantle's architectural wonders beneath the waves? Nyarlathotep attracts more varied worship than other cosmic entities because it alone demonstrates active interest in human affairs, appearing directly to followers rather than influencing them through dreams or requiring intermediaries. The Starry Wisdom sect operated in Providence from 1844 to 1877, using the shining trapezohedron to achieve visions of cosmic gulfs where Nyarlathotep dwells in various forms. The artifact functioned as technological rather than purely mystical object, a lens permitting perception across dimensional boundaries that normal human senses cannot access. The cultists didn't worship blindly, but observed actual cosmic realities through the trapezohedron, their devotion based on empirical evidence of Nyarlathotep's existence and power rather than mere faith. This makes their religion epistemologically sophisticated. They possess proof that conventional science lacked, making their apparent madness potentially superior, rationality recognizing truths that sanity requires ignoring. The witch cult traditions documented in The Dreams in the Witch House present Nyarlathotep as the black man presiding over Sabbaths, where initiates sign his book in blood and receive instruction in non-Euclidean mathematics, permitting physical movement through higher dimensions. These cults blend historical witch trial testimony with cosmic horror, suggesting that medieval accusations of devil worship documented actual encounters with Nyarlathotep, adapting its presentation to Christian-influenced populations who interpreted the entity through available theological categories. The cultists gain genuine power. Walter Gilman's mathematical insights allow him to traverse space-time in ways that violate physics, but the knowledge destroys them as completely as it empowers them, producing abilities they cannot control and understanding they cannot psychologically sustain. Egyptian cults, worshipping the Dark Pharaoh, represent Nyarlathotep's most ancient human-oriented form, suggesting the entity has engaged with civilization since prehistory. These cults supposedly preserved knowledge predating dynastic Egypt, maintaining traditions that conventional archaeology dismisses as superstition, but that might document actual contact with being existing across millennia. The various Nyarlathotep manifestations, Dark Pharaoh, Black Man, Haunter of the Dark, countless others, suggest either genuine shape-shifting or existence as distributed intelligence, manifesting differently depending on cultural context and worshippers' expectations, making the entity uniquely adaptable to human religious impulses. Yog-Sothoth cults pursue contact with entity existing simultaneously at all points in space and time, seeking knowledge accessible only to consciousness, experiencing past, present, and future as eternal present. The Dunwich Horror documents the Whately family's multi-generational project to breed with Yog-Sothoth, producing hybrid offspring combining human and trans-dimensional characteristics. Wilbur Whately's human appearance conceals alien biology, while his twin brother grows too vast and geometrically impossible to maintain human form, eventually requiring the entire Whately farmhouse to contain its expanding mass. The family's goal apparently involves opening gateways, permitting Yog-Sothoth's fuller manifestation on Earth, suggesting that worship aims at facilitating entities' invasion rather than merely venerating from safe distance. The relationship between grimoire study and Yog-Sothoth invocation proves central to these cults' practices. Whately masters the Necronomicon and other forbidden texts, using their formulas to maintain contact with his cosmic father and prepare rituals that should allow the entity greater access to Earth's dimensional framework. This makes the cults intellectually rigorous in ways that conventional religion isn't. Their devotion requires mastering complex mathematical and linguistic systems, understanding astronomical calculations, and performing rituals with precision that minor errors render catastrophically dangerous. The worship becomes almost scientific in its methodology, while pursuing goals that science categorically denies as possible. Recruitment patterns across Lovecraft's cults reveal that desperation, curiosity, heredity, and coercion operate as primary vectors for membership, with economic and social marginalization creating vulnerability to organizations promising knowledge, power, or material benefits that conventional society withholds. Captain Obed Marsh turned to Deep One worship after Innsmouth's legitimate maritime trade collapsed, his crew facing starvation, while neighboring Polynesian islanders prospered through their aquatic partnerships. The Whately family's rural isolation and poverty drove them toward cosmic entities offering power unavailable through conventional channels. Urban cults, like the Starry Wisdom sect, attracted educated individuals whose curiosity about forbidden knowledge outweighed their self-preservation instincts. This pattern suggests that cults exploit specific vulnerabilities. Economic desperation makes material rewards compelling. Intellectual curiosity makes forbidden knowledge irresistible. Social isolation makes belonging valuable, regardless of organization's nature. Lovecraft's classism and elitism suffuse these portrayals, consistently associating cult membership with lower class populations, racial minorities, and those he considered mentally or morally deficient, though occasional educated protagonists demonstrate that cosmic horror's appeal can transcend social boundaries. Social demographics in Lovecraft's cult fiction reflect his virulent prejudices, while inadvertently revealing how marginalized populations might possess epistemological advantages over privileged observers. The cults disproportionately involve mixed-race populations, immigrants, rural poor, and those existing outside Anglo-Saxon Protestant mainstream, groups Lovecraft considered genetically and culturally inferior, yet positioned as possessing genuine cosmic knowledge that civilized society lacks. This creates deeply uncomfortable dynamic. Lovecraft's racism insists these populations are degenerate, while his cosmic horror logic suggests their marginalization permits perceiving truths that privilege obscures. The degenerate cultists aren't deluded, but accurately apprehending cosmic realities, making their apparent inferiority actually epistemological superiority. Contemporary readers must navigate this tension, recognizing Lovecraft's prejudice as morally repugnant, while acknowledging that his fictional framework accidentally validates perspectives that dominant culture dismisses, even if Lovecraft himself would have been horrified by such interpretation. The progression from initial contact through transformation to irreversible commitment follows identifiable stages that make cult membership appear voluntary initially, while becoming coercive through accumulated changes that prevent retreat. First contact typically involves dreams, rumors, or economic opportunities that seem intriguing but not immediately dangerous. Initiation ceremonies provide staged revelations. New members receive partial truths, while complete theology remains concealed until psychological preparation permits fuller understanding without immediate breakdown. Transformation occurs gradually, whether biological, deep one hybridization developing across years, psychological, progressive obsession with cosmic knowledge, or social, increasing isolation from non-cultist community. The point of no return arrives when accumulated changes make return to normal society impossible. The hybrid's physical alterations become too pronounced to conceal, the scholar's cosmic awareness too complete to function in conventional reality, the cultist's social bonds too severed to imagine reintegration. This progression exploits sunk cost reasoning and gradual normalization of transgression, techniques that actual cults and totalist organizations employ to ensure members cannot easily disengage once sufficiently invested. Hybrid offspring represent cult membership's most disturbing manifestation because they never chose devotion, yet inherit its consequences through biology beyond their control. The deep one hybrids appear human in childhood, allowing normal socialization and education, but puberty triggers metamorphosis that conventional medicine cannot explain or prevent. These children face impossible situation. They didn't worship cosmic entities, didn't volunteer for transformation, yet their DNA ensures eventual change that will force them to abandon terrestrial life and join amphibious civilization in Yihantle's depths. Some embrace this destiny, like Robert Olmsted at The Shadow over Innsmouth's conclusion, who initially flees in horror but eventually accepts his transformation and plans to join his deep one relatives. Others presumably resist, though Lovecraft rarely documents such resistance, perhaps because genetic inevitability renders resistance meaningless. The hybrid children thus embody cult's ultimate violation, corruption of innocence who inherit damnation through bloodline rather than choice. The madness versus enlightenment question proves central to interpreting cult members' psychological states. Are they insane, suffering delusions that cosmic entities exist and care about worship, or enlightened, perceiving cosmic truths that sanity requires ignoring? Lovecraft's fiction systematically refuses clear answer, maintaining productive ambiguity that makes either interpretation plausible. The cultists certainly appear mad by conventional psychiatric standards. They worship beings they've never seen, perform rituals lacking empirical justification, believe in cosmology, contradicting established science, and often deteriorate into states requiring institutionalization. But the stories also provide evidence validating cult theology. The entities demonstrably exist within story logic. The rituals produce observable effects, and the cosmology, however disturbing, proves more accurate than conventional science's comfortable fictions. This suggests that madness and enlightenment might be identical in cosmic horror context. Accurate perception of reality that human psychology cannot integrate produces symptoms indistinguishable from psychosis, making psychiatric diagnosis irrelevant to question of whether the cultists' beliefs are true. Survivor testimony provides fragmentary inside perspectives on cult operations, while demonstrating that even those who escape physically cannot escape psychologically. Zadok Allen in The Shadow over Innsmouth survived the order of Dagon's founding generation, maintaining enough distance to avoid complete transformation while knowing too much to achieve genuine freedom. His alcoholism and paranoia demonstrate classic trauma responses, but his testimony proves substantially accurate when Robert Olmsted investigates. Former cultists cannot simply reintegrate into normal society because their knowledge remains. They've seen things that cannot be unseen, learned truths that cannot be unlearned, undergone experiences that conventional frameworks cannot accommodate. The survivor exists in liminal state between cult and society, belonging fully to neither. Their testimony simultaneously valuable. They know what actually occurred, and unreliable. Their psychological damage calls all testimony into question. This makes cult survival potentially worse than death. The dead at least achieve finality, while survivors endure indefinitely with knowledge that destroys peace while providing no compensation for its burden. Why cultists cannot simply leave extends beyond physical constraint to encompass biological, psychological, and social bonds that make departure literally unthinkable. Biologically, the Deep One hybrids cannot reject genetics written into cellular structure. Their transformation will occur regardless of theological beliefs. Psychologically, cult knowledge cannot be forgotten once acquired. Learning that Cthulhu exists doesn't permit returning to comfortable ignorance that Cthulhu doesn't. Socially, cult membership severs connections to conventional community while creating dependencies on cult network that become sole source of belonging, meaning, and identity. The combination makes leaving require simultaneously rejecting one's biology, denying one's knowledge, and abandoning one's community, a psychological impossibility for most humans, regardless of how intellectually they recognize the cult's destructiveness. Lovecraft's cults thus function as totalist institutions in Robert J. Lifton's sense, controlling every aspect of members' reality until alternatives become literally inconceivable, ensuring perpetuation through making departure psychologically impossible, even when physically available. The grimoires that cult members study, particularly the Necronomicon, but also Unersprechlichen Kulten, the Book of Ibon, and De Vermis Mysteries, function as technical manuals for cosmic horror, providing specific instructions for summoning entities, protection rituals during invocations, and historical accounts of previous human entity interactions. These texts don't offer vague mystical wisdom requiring interpretative flexibility, but detailed procedures with astronomical timing requirements, precise linguistic formulations, and material component specifications. Wilbur Whateley, in The Dunwich Horror, uses the Necronomicon to maintain contact with his Yog-Sothoth parentage and prepare rituals permitting fuller manifestation of cosmic forces on Earth. The specificity suggests that cult knowledge operates more like engineering than theology. Cultists aren't interpreting metaphorical truths, but following technical specifications for operations that violate physics, yet prove reproducible when procedures are correctly executed. This transforms forbidden knowledge from spiritual corruption into information hazard, data that human consciousness cannot process without catastrophic malfunction, regardless of moral or theological framework. Ritual efficacy remains deliberately ambiguous across Lovecraft's fiction, with sufficient evidence supporting both positions that rituals actually work and that cultists are deluded to prevent definitive resolution. Inspector Legrasse's cultists chanted invocations that coincided with global dream epidemic, and Rollier's brief surfacing suggesting causal relationship between ritual and cosmic event. But Legras's raid interrupted the ceremony, and Roulier sank again, leaving uncertain whether ritual completion would have produced different outcome or whether timing was coincidental. The Dunwich horror was successfully banished through counter-ritual employing formulas from the Necronomicon, demonstrating that some grimoire procedures produce measurable effects. Yet alternative explanations exist. Perhaps the entity departed for reasons unrelated to ritual, or psychological factors created placebo effect powerful enough to manifest physical consequences. This ambiguity proves essential to cosmic horror's effectiveness. Definitive proofs that rituals work would transform horror into fantasy where magic functions reliably, while definitive proof they don't work would eliminate cultists threatening credibility. Lovecraft maintains productive uncertainty where rituals might work, creating situations where rational observers cannot afford to assume cultists are merely delusional, even while hoping desperately that they are. Astronomical knowledge forms crucial component of cult theology, with cultists tracking stellar positions, planetary alignments, and cosmic cycles that determine when entities can manifest most fully in Earth's dimensional framework. The Call of Cthulhu establishes that Cthulhu's influence strengthens when the stars are right, astronomical configuration occurring cyclically across geological timeframes. The cults maintain calendars measuring eons rather than years, calculating when conditions will permit Aurelia's permanent rising and Cthulhu's complete awakening. This astronomical determinism makes cult activity simultaneously futile and rational. Futile because cosmic events will occur regardless of human worship. Rational because understanding these cycles permits preparation for inevitable transformations. The cultists aren't causing cosmic catastrophe through ritual, but preparing to align themselves with catastrophe that astronomical mechanics guarantee. This transforms worship from active petition into passive acceptance of deterministic universe. Religious practice acknowledging that human agency cannot alter cosmic outcomes, but can position humans to survive, or at least witness, events that unprepared humanity cannot comprehend. The price of cosmic awareness scales directly with comprehension's completeness, producing psychological and biological damage proportional to knowledge acquired. Minor revelations, learning that cosmic entities exist, produce manageable anxiety and philosophical disorientation. Moderate knowledge, understanding humanity's cosmic insignificance and entities' indifference, generates depression, nihilism, and potential suicidality as comforting illusions about meaning and purpose collapse. Complete understanding, fully perceiving cosmic reality's alien geometry, non-linear temporality, and dimensional complexity, produces breakdown that psychiatry categorizes as psychosis, but might more accurately represent consciousness, encountering input it cannot process. The starry wisdom, cultists who gazed too long through the shining trapezohedron didn't become delusional. They perceived actual realities that human neurology evolved never encountering and cannot integrate without catastrophic malfunction. This makes cosmic knowledge literally toxic to consciousness, information that destroys the information processing system attempting to contain it. Information asymmetry within cults creates hierarchical structure where leaders possess knowledge that would destroy initiates if revealed prematurely. The esoteric order of Dagon introduces new members gradually, first revealing that deep ones exist and provide economic benefits, then explaining the hybrid breeding program, finally disclosing that initiate's own biology ensures eventual transformation. This stage revelation permits psychological adjustment at each level before confronting next, more disturbing truth. Leaders who possess complete knowledge demonstrate through their continued functioning that human consciousness can adapt to cosmic horror if exposure occurs gradually enough, though their adaptation often involves becoming progressively less human in thought and behavior, even when biological transformation doesn't occur. The information asymmetry thus protects organizational stability. Revealing everything simultaneously would produce mass psychotic break, destroying cult infrastructure, while graduated revelation ensures sufficient members retain enough sanity at each level to maintain organizational continuity. The ultimate revelation toward which cult knowledge progresses varies by organization, but consistently involves recognizing that human categories, values, and consciousness represent provincial accidents having no cosmic validity. The Cthulhu cultists learn that when the great old ones return, human civilization will be casually eliminated not through malice, but through indifference, the way human construction projects eliminate on colonies without architects noticing or caring about insect casualties. The Yog-Sothoth worshippers discover that linear time and causality are local phenomena, that past, present, future distinctions represent human perceptual limitations rather than universal truths. The Deep One initiates realize that human form isn't privileged biological configuration, but temporary evolutionary stage before transformation into something older, more durable, and adapted to realities that terrestrial surface dwelling never required confronting. These revelations share common structure. They demonstrate that everything humans consider essential, meaningful, or valuable represents narrow provincial perspective that cosmic reality doesn't acknowledge. The ultimate forbidden knowledge is that there is no ultimate meaning, that consciousness seeking meaning in meaningless universe represents category error that only madness or transformation can resolve. What happens when cultists achieve their goals, when rituals successfully summon entities, when transformations complete, when the stars align correctly, receives minimal documentation in Lovecraft's fiction, perhaps because success represents apocalypse, preventing further narrative. The Call of Cthulhu describes Arlia's brief rising and Cthulhu's partial emergence, events that produce casualties and insanity among witnesses before the city sank again. The Dunwich Horror documents what occurs when Yog-Sothoth's hybrid offspring grows to sufficient size and power to begin opening dimensional gateways, destruction spreading across countryside until counter-ritual banishes the entity. The Shadow over Innsmouth concludes with Robert Olmsted accepting his transformation and planning to join Yhantle's amphibious civilization, suggesting that for Deep One hybrids, goal achievement means abandoning humanity to join older, stranger culture beneath waves. These fragmentary outcomes share a common element. Cult success produces transformation or destruction, never apotheosis or salvation in conventional sense. The cultists don't achieve transcendence, but elimination of human identity, human civilization, or humanity itself, making their worship's ultimate goal indistinguishable from species-level suicide pursued with religious fervor. Dagon, 1917, introduces cult worship as atmospheric background detail rather than central narrative element, establishing template that later stories would elaborate. The narrator, morphine-addicted survivor of wartime trauma, describes discovering risen Pacific seabed covered with cyclopean monolith, carved with hieroglyphics, depicting mostly like men, beings, worshipping massive aquatic creature. The carvings suggest organized religion predating human civilization, ancient devotional practices directed toward entity the narrator glimpses emerging from depths, creature of such scale and alienness that witnessing it produces psychological collapse requiring narcotic management. This brief story establishes pattern. Remote locations harbor evidence of non-human worship. Human witnesses cannot psychologically survive encounters, and the entities receiving devotion exist independently of whether humans acknowledge them. The cult activities remain off-screen, documented through archaeological traces rather than direct observation, technique that suggests vast religious traditions operating beyond human awareness. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, elevates cult worship from background to structural principle, presenting global conspiracy of coordinated devotion as central mystery requiring investigation. The story's tripartite structure, academic research, police raid documentation, sailors' testimony, assembles evidence that worldwide Cthulhu worship exists across cultures with no apparent contact, suggesting either mass delusion or genuine phenomenon affecting human consciousness globally. Professor Angel's research documents the March 1925 dream epidemic, where artists, poets, and sensitives worldwide experienced identical visions of alien cities and incomprehensible chanting. Inspector Legrasse's 1907 Louisiana raid provides direct observation of cult ritual. Men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type, performing orgiastic licentiousness around fire while chanting Funglui Mglwinaf Cthulhu Rolia Ugainagel Vtagen. The Norwegian manuscript describes encountering risen Rolia and Cthulhu itself, validating cult theology through direct entity contact. This accumulation establishes that cults aren't isolated phenomena, but coordinated global network, their worship based on actual cosmic realities rather than mere superstition. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, shifts focus from established cults to family unit pursuing cosmic communion across generations, demonstrating that devotional corruption can operate at household scale without requiring large organizational infrastructure. The Whately family's multi-generational project to breed with Yog-Sothoth produces Wilbur Whately, who appears human despite alien biology, and his twin brother, who grows too vast and geometrically impossible to maintain human form. The family maintains private cult centered on grimoire study and ritual practice, with Wilbur mastering the Necronomicon sufficiently to communicate with his cosmic father and prepare ceremonies that should permit fuller dimensional manifestation. This introduces concept of decentralized cult activity, not hierarchical organizations with temples and priesthoods, but isolated practitioners pursuing independent cosmic contact while sharing common theological framework derived from circulating forbidden texts. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, presents cults functioning as intermediaries between humanity and alien species, suggesting that some cosmic worship involves explicit negotiation rather than blind devotion. The Vermont cult worshipping the Mygo, fungal entities from Yugoth-shire Pluto, receives technological artifacts and esoteric knowledge in exchange for allowing brain extractions, permitting interstellar transport. This transactional relationship strips away religious mystery. The cultists aren't confused primitives, but pragmatic operators, exploiting alien technology for personal benefit. The story's epistolary structure, with protagonist Henry Akeley corresponding about his cult infiltration before revealing himself as compromised, demonstrates how cult corruption spreads through communication itself. Dangerous knowledge, transmitted through letters that seem scholarly, but actually function as vectors for mimetic infection. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, reveals that cult worship predates humanity by millions of years, with the Elder Things, Antarctic murals depicting their own religious practices directed toward entities they could neither comprehend nor control. The discovery that non-human civilizations engaged in devotional activities toward cosmic forces suggests that worship represents universal response to encountering superior powers rather than specifically human psychological quirk. This retroactively validates human cults. If beings millions of years older and vastly more sophisticated than humans found cosmic entities worthy of religious attention, then human cultists aren't delusional primitives, but participants in ancient tradition extending across species and eons. The Elder Things' eventual extinction, despite their worship, reinforces cosmic horror's central pessimism. Devotion provides no protection, only delayed recognition of inevitable doom. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, provides Lovecraft's most comprehensive cult study, examining complete life cycle from foundation through generational perpetuation to government intervention and survivors' compromised existence. Robert Olmsted's investigation reveals the esoteric order of Dagon's transformation of entire town into cult ecosystem, where economics, biology, and theology operate inseparably. The narrative documents cult recruitment, Captain Marsh's initial contact, institutional development, order's formal organization and hierarchy, biological consequences, hybrid offspring's gradual transformation, social control mechanisms, isolation enforcing secrecy, and ultimate failure of external intervention. Government raid cannot prevent genetic inevitabilities. This story establishes template for comprehensive cult analysis that subsequent writers would reference when developing their own fictional religious organizations. The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, examines cult aftermath with the Starry Wisdom Sect's 1844 to 1877 activities reconstructed posthumously through artifacts and fragmentary records after the organization's dissolution. Robert Blake's fatal investigation of abandoned church demonstrates that cult corruption persists beyond organizational lifespan. The shining trapezohedron remains dangerous decades after worship is dispersed, suggesting that cult artifacts carry permanent contamination independent of human users. This introduces concept of cult archaeology, studying extinct religious movements through material culture they left behind, technique that makes cults accessible to analysis, while emphasizing that understanding them proves as dangerous as participating in them. The cross-story validation becomes explicit. Blake references Cthulhu, the Necronomicon, and other mythos elements as established fact, treating earlier stories, inventions as shared reality, requiring no re-explanation. The narrative's tripartite structure employs documentary assemblage technique, forcing readers to reconstruct cult activities from fragmentary evidence spanning different times, locations, and perspectives. Francis Thurston inherits his uncle George Gamble Angel's research materials after the professor's mysterious 1926 death, discovering papers suggesting worldwide phenomenon that mainstream scholarship dismissed. This frame narrative creates epistemic uncertainty. From opening, we cannot verify Thurston's interpretation of his uncle's notes, cannot confirm whether connections drawn between disparate incidents represent actual pattern or paranoid over-interpretation. The structure mirrors conspiracy theory development, collecting genuinely documented events and drawing connections that might reveal hidden truth or might impose false coherence on random occurrences. Lovecraft refuses definitive resolution, maintaining ambiguity that makes either interpretation plausible while ensuring that cosmic horror explanation proves most psychologically disturbing. The first section, The Horror in Clay, documents Henry Anthony Wilcox's March 1925 sculptural productions and dreams that Professor Angel initially dismisses as artistic fantasy. Wilcox brings bas relief depicting a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. The artist claims the design emerged from wonderful dreams, featuring stone cities and chanting in unknown language that Angel transcribes as the Cthulhu Ftagen. The professor's interest intensifies when discovering that during identical March period, poets, architects, and sensitives worldwide reported similar dreams and produced artwork with consistent features despite no apparent contact between creators. This synchronicity eliminates prosaic explanations. Either mass delusion affects sensitive individuals globally, or genuine phenomenon influences human consciousness simultaneously across continents. The story systematically closes conventional interpretative options, leaving cosmic horror as most plausible framework. The second section, The Tale of Inspector Legros, provides historical depth through Angel's notes from 1908 American Archaeological Society meeting. New Orleans Police Inspector John Raymond Legros brought small statuette seeking identification, explaining its seizure during November 1907 raid on swamp cult performing human sacrifice. The cultists, described as men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type, chanted Funglui, Amchilwanaf, Cthulhu, Ralia, Wugahanagel Ftagen, while dancing around sacrificial fire. The interrogation of cult leader Castro reveals theology spanning millennia. Great old ones, arrived from stars before humans existed, built Ralia and other cities now sunken, and wait in death sleep until astronomical conditions permit their return, when they would rise and bring the earth again beneath their sway. The cultists don't understand what they worship in any comprehensive sense. Their knowledge comes through dreams and oral traditions passed across generations, but their worship proves functional by maintaining Cthulhu's presence in human consciousness and preparing psychological conditions for eventual return. Legros's description of the cult ritual emphasizes its combination of organized structure and apparent chaos. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Castro's testimony provides theological framework. The great old ones were not composed altogether of flesh and blood, existing in state between life and death that conventional categories cannot accommodate. They communicated through dreams with sensitive humans, transmitting visions and instructions that cultists interpreted as religious directives. The cult's geographic distribution, from Louisiana bayous to Arctic wastes to Pacific islands, demonstrates coordination impossible through normal communication channels, suggesting that dream contact provides actual mechanism for synchronizing worship globally. This makes the cults simultaneously independent. Each cell develops autonomously and coordinated. All receive identical transmissions from sleeping entity. The third section, The Madness from the Sea, provides physical confirmation through Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen's posthumous manuscript describing his crew's March 1925 encounter with the risen Ardlia. Johansen's account validates cult theology with disturbing precision. His ship encountered derelict vessel crewed by Kanaka and half-caste sailors who attacked without provocation, then discovered uncharted island that rose weird and distant in the limitless waters. The island's architecture violated perception. Geometry was all wrong, with angles that didn't meet correctly and proportions that shifted depending on viewing position. Opening a massive stone door released Cthulhu itself, described in passage achieving iconic status despite, or because of, its resistance to coherent description. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. The entity pursued Johansen's crew, killing several before the survivors escaped by ramming their ship into Cthulhu, which burst with a slushing noise, but immediately began reforming. The accumulation of evidence across 3 sections creates pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, yet too disturbing to accept as reality. Wilcox's dreams coincide temporally with Aurelia's rising and Johansen's encounter. The Louisiana cults' chants match Wilcox's unconscious vocalizations. The statuette seized from cultists resembles Wilcox's independent sculptural creation. The worldwide dream epidemic during March 1925 correlates with documented geological event, Aurelia's brief surfacing, that conventional science cannot explain. Lovecraft structures the evidence to eliminate escape routes. Either all witnesses independently hallucinated identical impossibilities at the same time, statistically implausible, or cosmic horror explanation that Cthulhu exists, influences dreams globally, and briefly manifested physically, proves more parsimonious despite violating every comfortable assumption about reality's nature. Thurston's closing meditation articulates cosmic horror's essential epistemological problem. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. He argues that humanity's fragmented understanding, our inability to synthesize all available evidence into coherent picture, protects sanity by preventing recognition of our actual cosmic situation. The cults represent those who voyaged too far, who correlated enough contents to perceive pattern that complete correlation would render unbearable. Their worship acknowledges truth that ignorance conceals. Human consciousness is accident. Cosmic entities exist indifferent to our welfare. An eventual return of great old ones represents astronomical certainty rather than theological possibility. The cultists aren't deluded, but tragically rational. Their apparent madness actually superior epistemology, recognizing realities that sanity requires ignoring. This inversion, positioning worshippers of tentacled gods as potentially more accurate observers of cosmic truth than rational skeptics, represents the call of Cthulhu's most disturbing implication and establishes template for how Lovecraft's cult fiction interrogates relationship between madness, knowledge, and reality. The shadow over Innsmouth functions as Lovecraft's most comprehensive cult ethnography, documenting complete life cycle from economic desperation through theological innovation to biological transformation across generations. The narrative employs classic investigative structure. Outsider Robert Olmsted visits declining Massachusetts seaport, gradually discovers horrifying truth through observation and testimony, attempts escape, and ultimately discovers his own inescapable connection to what he investigated. This progression from detached observer to compromised participant mirrors how cult corruption operates. Investigation requires proximity. Proximity creates vulnerability, and vulnerability transforms into infection that geographic distance cannot cure. The story's power derives from methodical accumulation of disturbing details rather than sudden revelation, building portrait of community where cult worship permeates every aspect of existence until distinguishing religious devotion from economic necessity, social structure, or biological destiny becomes impossible. The esoteric order of Dagon's foundation narrative demonstrates how material crisis creates theological opportunity. Captain Obed Marsh established the organization in the 1840s after encountering Pacific Island cults that worshipped fish-like entities and prospered through their devotion. Innsmouth's legitimate maritime trade had collapsed, the town facing economic extinction when Marsh imported these practices and negotiated covenant with deep ones dwelling beneath Devil Reef. The deal proved straightforward. The amphibious beings would provide gold artifacts and ensure abundant fishing in exchange for human sacrifices and interbreeding producing hybrid offspring. Zadok Allen's drunken testimony to Olmsted provides crucial details. Obed, he learnt that they's things on this earth as most folks never heard about and wouldn't believe if they did hear. The cultists weren't deluded primitives, but pragmatic operators exploiting discovered opportunity. Their worship, based on empirical observation of entities that demonstrably existed and provided measurable benefits. The cult hierarchy correlates directly with degree of deep one ancestry, creating visible biological stratification that makes religious advancement literally corporeal transformation. The Marsh family, possessing greatest hybrid lineage, exhibits most pronounced alterations: bulging, starry eyes, flat noses, receding foreheads and chins, skin with greenish-gray tinge, and gill-like structures on neck. These features become more pronounced with age as transformation progresses, eventually requiring affected individuals to abandon terrestrial life entirely for Yuha-Inthale's underwater city. Lower-ranking cultists show minimal changes in youth, permitting normal socialization, but gradual metamorphosis proves genetically inevitable regardless of personal beliefs. This creates a situation where cult membership becomes inescapable biological destiny. You cannot apostatize from religion encoded in DNA, cannot reject theology, manifesting through physical changes that witnesses cannot help but observe as markers of religious status within community. The recruitment and control mechanisms operate through combination of material incentives, social isolation, and biological inevitability that makes resistance practically impossible for Innsmouth residents. The town's economic dependence on deep one, gold, and fishing success creates financial incentive for cooperation. Geographic and social isolation. Innsmouth's decline drove away most outside contact, leaving population increasingly inbred and cult-dominated, eliminates alternative social networks that might support resistance. The hybrid breeding program ensures that increasing percentage of population carries genes guaranteeing transformation, making cult membership literally hereditary. Zadok Allen's testimony reveals the progression. Initial resistance from some townspeople was overcome through murder and intimidation. Holdouts were gradually eliminated or fled, and within single generation, the order achieved complete social control. By Olmsted's 1927 visit, nearly entire remaining population either belongs to the cult or maintains terrified silence about activities they dare not oppose. Olmsted's investigation progresses through stages that mirror classic cult infiltration narrative, while adding cosmic horror's distinctive elements. Initial observations note Innsmouth's decay and inhabitants' disturbing appearance, unwholesome skin, shambling gait, fishy odor, details that seem merely poverty and inbreeding before the true significance becomes apparent. Zadok Allen's testimony provides historical context, explaining what Olmsted observes. The drunk old man's account initially dismissed as alcohol-fueled fantasy before accumulating evidence validates his claims. The nocturnal pursuit through Innsmouth streets, with hybrid cultists hunting Olmsted after his hotel room eavesdropping is discovered, transforms investigation from academic exercise to survival horror, the pursued protagonist glimpsing his hunter's full physical alterations during chase. The escape to Arkham and subsequent federal raid that destroys Devil Reef and arrests cult leadership appears to provide conventional closure before the story's final devastating revelation. The conclusion's double movement, external destruction of cult infrastructure, followed by Olmsted's discovery of his own marsh ancestry, demonstrates that cult corruption persists beyond organizational dismantling. The 1928 federal raid torpedoed Devil Reef, arrested surviving cultists, and supposedly ended the order of Dagon's operations. But Olmsted's genealogical research reveals his grandmother was Marsh family member who fled Innsmouth, meaning he carries Deep One genes that will inevitably produce transformation regardless of cult's organizational status. His final entry describes accepting this biological destiny. I shall plan my cousin's escape from that Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to marvel-shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses to Cyclopean and many-columned Yehantley, and in that lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. The transformation from horrified investigator to willing participant demonstrates cult corruption's ultimate effectiveness, not through coercion, but through making resistance psychologically untenable once full knowledge is achieved. The story's treatment of biological transformation as religious destiny raises disturbing questions about free will, identity, and what constitutes genuine conversion versus genetic inevitability. Olmsted didn't choose Deep One ancestry, didn't volunteer for transformation, yet his biology ensures changes that will eventually make terrestrial life impossible and underwater existence necessary. His final acceptance might represent genuine theological conversion, achieving understanding that makes amphibious civilization seem preferable to human society, or might be psychological accommodation to inevitable outcome, choosing to embrace what cannot be prevented. The ambiguity proves essential. If transformation is purely biological, then cult conversion represents genetic determinism rather than religious choice, making the Order of Dagon less church than breeding program using theological language to describe eugenic project. If psychological conversion is genuine, then perhaps the Deep One perspective offers actual advantages over human limitations, making cultists' choice rational rather than deluded. Lovecraft refuses to resolve this tension, maintaining both possibilities simultaneously and suggesting that in cosmic horror, context, biological and theological transformation might be indistinguishable. Your body changes, your mind adapts, and the question of which drives which becomes meaningless when the outcome proves identical regardless of causal sequence. August Derleth's posthumous expansion of Lovecraft's cult mythology demonstrates both preservation and problematic systematization, transforming ambiguous cosmic horror into organized fantasy cosmology. After Lovecraft's 1937 death, Derleth positioned himself as literary executor and mythological codifier, completing fragmentary stories and developing comprehensive theological framework that Lovecraft deliberately avoided creating. Derleth's most controversial contribution involved imposing good versus evil dualism completely foreign to Lovecraft's philosophy, positioning benevolent elder gods, opposing malevolent great old ones in eternal cosmic struggle. This Christianized interpretation flattened Lovecraft's more disturbing vision of indifferent cosmos into conventional moral conflict, transforming cults from worshippers of entities beyond good and evil into simple villain organizations serving evil side. Derleth also systematized cult activities along elemental lines, water cults worshipping Cthulhu, air cults devoted to Hastur, creating taxonomic precision that satisfied completist desires while eliminating productive ambiguity essential to cosmic horror's effectiveness. His work demonstrates persistent tension in collaborative mythology between comprehensive knowledge, appealing to fans seeking complete understanding, and preserved mystery, necessary for maintaining philosophical horror. Robert Bloch's cult contributions maintained greater fidelity to Lovecraft's ambiguous approach while adding psychological sophistication reflecting evolving understanding of religious extremism. Bloch's development of the Starry Wisdom sect in stories like The Shambler from the Stars and The Shadow from the Steeple provided institutional detail that Lovecraft's original The Haunter of the Dark only sketched. Bloch explored cult members' motivations, intellectual curiosity, desire for power, genuine belief in cosmic revelation, with nuance that recognized religious devotion's psychological complexity rather than dismissing cultists as mere antagonists. His urban cult settings, particularly Providence-based organizations, demonstrated how cosmic horror could operate in modern cities rather than requiring exotic locations, making cult activity feel locally immediate rather than geographically distant. Bloch also examined cult aftermath more thoroughly than Lovecraft typically did, documenting how suppressed organizations leave psychological and occult residue affecting subsequent generations who discover their artifacts and documentation. Ramsey Campbell's British transposition of Lovecraftian cults to Severn Valley and other English locations demonstrated the mythology's cultural portability while exposing its American-specific elements. Campbell's Goatswood cult in stories like The Moon Lens adapted Lovecraft's New England isolation and decay to British context, replacing Puritan heritage with older pagan traditions and American racial anxieties with class tensions distinctive to English society. His cults often involved working-class populations exploited by educated occultists who possessed grimoire knowledge, creating power dynamics reflecting British class structure rather than American ethnic divisions. Campbell also emphasized cults' bureaucratic mundanity, cultists holding regular meetings, maintaining membership rolls, conducting administrative business, demonstrating that cosmic horror could coexist with organizational tedium. This approach made cults feel simultaneously more realistic. Religious organizations do require administration, and more disturbing, the banality of evil applied to cosmic worship, showing that devotion to alien gods doesn't preclude committee meetings and membership dues. Modern mythos writers demonstrate remarkable range in cult treatment, from Laird Barron's corporate cult structures to Caitlin R. Kiernan's psychological interrogations of devotional impulse to Victor Laval's examination of race and cosmic horror through cult dynamics. Barron's stories frequently feature cults operating as businesses or subsidiaries of larger corporate entities, suggesting that late capitalism's organizational forms prove hospitable to cosmic worship. The same structures that pursue quarterly profits can pursue entity summoning with equivalent bureaucratic efficiency. His cultists are often wealthy, educated individuals whose resources and intelligence make them more rather than less dangerous, inverting Lovecraft's association of cult activity with lower class degeneracy. Kiernan's work explores cults as psychological phenomena, communities forming around shared delusions or genuine cosmic perceptions, with the distinction remaining deliberately unclear. Treating worship as fundamentally about human meaning-making in meaningless universe rather than focusing on entities themselves. Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom retells the horror at Red Hook from perspective of black protagonist experiencing both cosmic and racial horror, demonstrating how Lovecraft's cult framework can illuminate contemporary racial violence while exposing how original stories positioned racial others as threats rather than humans, confronting genuine horror. Gaming codifications, particularly through Call of Cthulhu RPG and various board game implementations, transformed cults from narrative elements into mechanical systems with defined organizational structures, recruitment patterns, and statistical attributes. The RPG's supplements provide comprehensive cult templates, leadership hierarchies, funding sources, ritual calendars, security measures that game masters can deploy or modify for scenarios. This systematization serves practical purpose, enabling consistent gameplay while potentially undermining cosmic horror's effectiveness by making cults too comprehensible, too mechanically transparent. The game's most successful cult scenarios maintain ambiguity about whether organizations are genuinely contacting cosmic entities or suffering collective delusion, preserving uncertainty essential to horror, even within framework requiring statistical representation. Recent editions have also confronted Lovecraft's racism more directly, providing guidance for running cult scenarios that explore religious extremism and fanaticism without reproducing original stories' ethnic prejudices, acknowledging that cosmic horror's insights about human vulnerability to totalizing ideologies remain valuable despite their creators' repugnant politics. Feminist reinterpretations examine gender dynamics in Lovecraft's cult structures, noting that his stories rarely feature female cultists in leadership positions and typically cast women as victims, breeders, or peripheral figures. Contemporary writers like Ruth Anna Emrys in the Innsmouth Legacy series center female Deep One hybrids as protagonists, exploring what cult membership and transformation mean from perspective of women making conscious choices about their biology and community rather than being passive vessels for hereditary corruption. These reinterpretations reveal that Lovecraft's cosmic indifference should logically extend to human gender categories. Entities that don't care about humanity certainly don't care about human sex distinctions, yet his cults consistently reflect early 20th century patriarchal assumptions. Correcting this anachronism, while preserving cosmic horror's philosophical core, demonstrates that the framework can be separated from its creator's specific prejudices, that cults worshipping in different cosmos can include women in leadership while maintaining the fundamental terror of devotion without reciprocity. Post-colonial readings critique Lovecraft's consistent association of non-Western peoples with cult corruption, examining how his stories position racial and cultural others as vectors for cosmic horror that threatens white Western civilization. Critics note that Lovecraft's cults disproportionately involve mixed-race populations, immigrants, and indigenous peoples, suggesting that deviation from Anglo-Saxon norms correlates with cosmic contamination. Contemporary reinterpretations invert this dynamic. If cosmic entities are genuinely indifferent to human categories, then Western rationalism's dismissal of non-Western religious practices might represent epistemological limitation rather than cultural superiority. Stories like Narlow Hopkinson's work explore what happens when marginalized populations' spiritual traditions prove more cosmically accurate than dominant cultures' scientific materialism, suggesting that those Lovecraft positioned as primitive or degenerate might actually possess superior understanding of reality's true nature. This reading recuperates cosmic horror's anti-anthropocentrism while rejecting its racism, arguing that the philosophy of human cosmic insignificance should undermine all human hierarchies, including racial ones, rather than reinforcing them. The suppressed cult, threading through collaborative expansions, exists primarily through absence and deliberate editorial silence. References to worship practices too transgressive for explicit development, even in fiction explicitly exploring transgressive themes. Some modern writers hint at sexual cult activities that Lovecraft could only obliquely reference. Others develop extreme violence that pulp magazines wouldn't publish. Still others pursue philosophical implications about consciousness and meaning that approach territories where horror becomes genuinely unbearable rather than entertainingly disturbing. But the most persistent, suppressed element involves confronting what it would actually mean to worship genuinely indifferent cosmos, not entities that ignore humans, but universe fundamentally structured such that human consciousness, meaning, and values represent category errors, mistakes that reality itself doesn't acknowledge. Developing this implication completely might produce fiction so nihilistic that writing or reading it becomes psychologically untenable, suggesting that even cosmic horror recognizes boundaries beyond which transgression serves no artistic or philosophical purpose. The suppressed cult thus represents not specific organization, but the limit point where cosmic horror's logic, if pursued to absolute conclusion, would eliminate the possibility of creating or engaging with fiction at all. The esoteric order of Dagon exists as actual religious organization founded in 2001, transforming Lovecraft's fictional cult into a functioning spiritual community with formal structure, rituals, and theological framework based explicitly on cosmic horror principles. The organization maintains online presence, publishes devotional materials, and conducts ceremonies adapted from Lovecraft's descriptions while acknowledging their fictional origins. This creates a deliberately ambiguous situation. Members simultaneously know that Cthulhu and the Deep Ones originated in pulp fiction while treating them as psychologically or spiritually effective thought forms worthy of genuine devotion. The order exemplifies contemporary religious innovation where acknowledged fiction becomes basis for sincere practice, participants arguing that metaphysical reality matters less than psychological and communal effects of ritual engagement. Whether this constitutes parody, sincere new religious movement, or productive category confusion between the two remains deliberately unresolved, mirroring Lovecraft's own narrative ambiguities about whether cults worship real entities or sustain collective delusions. Innsmouth-inspired urban legends circulate in coastal New England towns, particularly those experiencing economic decline and population loss, similar to Lovecraft's fictional seaport, Gloucester, Massachusetts, believed partial inspiration for Innsmouth, hosts Lovecraft-themed tours, while locals report occasional sightings of strange swimmers near offshore rocks and whisper about old families whose members exhibit unusual physical characteristics. These legends blend Lovecraft's fiction with genuine anxieties about declining fishing industries, opioid epidemics, and communities struggling to maintain identity as traditional economic bases collapse. The Innsmouth look becomes a metaphor for poverty's physical manifestations: poor dental care, inadequate nutrition, limited healthcare access, producing visible differences between economically marginalized and prosperous populations. The legends thus perform complex cultural work, using cosmic horror vocabulary to process real social anxieties about class, decline, and difference, while maintaining plausible deniability about whether participants actually believe in Deep Ones or merely find the framework useful for articulating uncomfortable truths about economic abandonment. Online communities claiming actual Cthulhu worship maintain studied ambiguity between ironic performance and sincere belief, creating spaces where the distinction becomes deliberately meaningless. Subreddits like r Cthulhu and various Discord servers host discussions mixing obvious jokes with seemingly earnest theological development, participants debating proper ritual procedures, sharing dreams they interpret as cosmic contact, and documenting signs of great old one's influence in contemporary events. Some posts clearly constitute creative writing or roleplay. Others maintain deadpan sincerity that could indicate genuine belief or sophisticated commitment to sustained ironic performance, and many exist in productive gray area where the poster might not know their own level of seriousness. This postmodern religious engagement reflects broader cultural patterns where sincerity and irony intertwine inseparably, where people can simultaneously mock and practice belief systems, where the question, "Do you really believe this?" generates responses like define, really, and believe that refuse conventional categories. Chaos magic practitioners explicitly adopt Lovecraftian entities and cult structures as working systems, arguing that fictional thought forms function identically to traditionally real spiritual beings for psychological and magical purposes. The chaos magic movement, codified through texts like Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut, and Phil Hines' Condensed Chaos treats belief as technology. Practitioners temporarily adopt belief systems to achieve altered consciousness states, then discard them when utility expires. Lovecraft's entities prove ideal for this approach. Their acknowledged fictionality eliminates religious dogmatism, while their conceptual richness provides sophisticated symbolic vocabulary for exploring consciousness, reality, and meaning. Chaos magicians perform Cthulhu invocations, construct Nyarlathotep altars, and employ cult organizational structures from Lovecraft's fiction while maintaining that metaphysical questions about whether entities exist miss the point. The practices produce measurable psychological effects regardless of ontological status, making philosophical debates about reality versus fiction functionally irrelevant to magical efficacy. Reported cult activity in abandoned churches and coastal locations generates periodic investigation by paranormal enthusiasts and law enforcement, occasionally discovering evidence of ritual practices that might indicate sincere Lovecraftian worship, or elaborate hoaxes exploiting cosmic horror's cultural presence. Providence police have investigated reports of gatherings in the vicinity of the original Free Will Baptist Church, inspiration for the Starry Wisdom Temple, finding candles, makeshift altars, and graffiti incorporating mythos symbols. Coastal areas near Devil's Reef, analog locations report discoveries of carved idols, ritual circles, and other paraphernalia suggesting either genuine cult activity or sophisticated staging by people familiar with Lovecraft's descriptions. The ambiguity proves essential. Absolute proof of hoax would eliminate unsettling possibility that some practitioners take fictional frameworks seriously enough to attempt actual cosmic contact, while definitive evidence of sincere belief would transform cosmic horror into documented sociological phenomenon, losing its fictional charge. The persistent uncertainty maintains productive space where Lovecraft's cults exist neither as pure fiction nor verified reality, but as cultural presence capable of generating real-world effects regardless of participants' metaphysical commitments. The Necronomicon hoax, enabling actual ritual practice, demonstrates how fictional grimoires achieve quasi-reality through sustained cultural engagement. The Simon Necronomicon, published by Avon Books in 1977, combined Lovecraft's invented mythology with actual Sumerian deity names and quasi-historical occult material, creating text that some practitioners treat as genuine ancient grimoire, despite its obviously modern composition. Occult bookstores stock it alongside traditional magical texts. Practitioners incorporate its rituals into working systems, and testimonials describe results obtained through its procedures. Whether these results originate from external entities, psychological effects, or placebo mechanisms remains deliberately ambiguous. This creates a situation where grimoire exists as physical object that can be purchased and used in actual rituals, despite everyone involved knowing it originated as literary device, demonstrating that functional reality of magical texts depends less on historical authenticity than on whether practitioners find them psychologically and ritually effective. Why people want to believe Lovecraft documented real cults rather than inventing fictional ones reveals persistent human discomfort with meaninglessness and randomness. Discovering that cosmic entities exist and cults worship them successfully would prove universe contains pattern, purpose, and meaning, even if that meaning involves humanity's cosmic insignificance and eventual extinction. This represents preferable alternative to accepting that consciousness is accident, that meaning is fiction we impose on purposeless matter, that the universe operates with genuine indifference rather than malevolent attention. The cultists, however deluded or doomed, at least matter enough for cosmic entities to notice, even if that notice proves catastrophic. Better to be destroyed by indifferent God than to exist in universe where gods don't exist, and destruction is merely random thermodynamic process. The desire to believe Lovecraft's cults are real, thus represents not attraction to cosmic horror, but flight from cosmic horror's ultimate implication, that even the tentacled monsters are comforting fiction compared to actual reality, where nothing cares enough about humanity to threaten us, where our existence and extinction both register as equally meaningless fluctuations in matter's temporary configurations. Cinematic representations of Lovecraftian cults consistently struggle with tension between showing enough cult activity to establish threat while maintaining ambiguity about whether worship produces genuine results or represents collective delusion. Stuart Gordon's Dagon, 2001, transposes Innsmouth to Spanish fishing village, depicting the esoteric order with remarkable fidelity to source material. Hybrid, transformations, underwater city, economic desperation driving theological innovation. The film's effectiveness derives from treating cults seriously as functioning religious community rather than mere antagonist organization, showing worship services, initiation ceremonies, and social control mechanisms with quasi-documentary attention. But visual medium's demand for concrete imagery inevitably reduces mystery. We see the deep ones as physical entities with specific designs, eliminating Lovecraft's productive ambiguity about whether they exist objectively or represent cultists' shared psychosis. The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, employed silent film aesthetics to suggest rather than show cult activities, maintaining period-appropriate distance from explicit ritual depictions while preserving story's documentary structure through intertitles and expressionist staging. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, represents most philosophically sophisticated film treatment of cult dynamics, examining how fictional cults achieve reality through sustained belief and what happens when fiction's boundaries collapse. The film's Cthulhu analog entity manifests not despite being fictional, but because being fictional proves no barrier to affecting reality once sufficient readers engage the narrative. The cultists aren't worshipping despite knowing entities are fictional. They worship because fiction and reality prove indistinguishable at sufficient scale of collective engagement. This metafictional approach captures something essential about Lovecraft's cults that literal adaptations miss. Their power derives not from cosmic entities' objective existence, but from human consciousness's vulnerability to totalizing narratives, making the question of whether gods are real less relevant than whether belief in them produces real-world effects. Gaming implementations demonstrate remarkable range in cult mechanics, from Call of Cthulhu, RPG's detailed organizational templates, to Bloodborne's cosmic horror, church structures offering mechanical advantages that corrupt players. The tabletop RPG provides comprehensive cult-building tools, hierarchies, funding sources, recruitment patterns, security measures, ritual calendars. Game masters can deploy pre-designed organizations or construct custom cults using modular components, creating infinite variations on Lovecraftian worship. The system's sanity mechanics ensure that investigating cults produces psychological damage. Players lose sanity points from witnessing rituals, reading cult documents, or understanding theology too completely. This mechanizes Lovecraft's core insight that knowledge destroys, transforming narrative observation into gameplay consequence, where accumulating information about cults correlates directly with character deterioration. Bloodborne integrates cult dynamics into core gameplay through the Healing Church, organization that provides genuine benefits, health restoration, power enhancement, while concealing that their sacraments derive from cosmic entities incompatible with human biology. Players must engage church systems to progress, making cult participation mechanically necessary rather than optional moral choice. The game brilliantly captures how cults normalize transgression. What seems helpful initially, blood healing, gradually reveals disturbing implications. The blood comes from cosmic beings, but by the time full truth emerges, players are mechanically dependent on systems they've learned to find horrifying. The insight mechanic parallels cosmic horror's knowledge as curse principle. Accumulating insight reveals previously invisible entities and environmental details, but increases vulnerability to specific attacks and reduces defensive capabilities, making expanded awareness mechanically disadvantageous, even as it reveals truth about game world's actual nature. Board game implementations like Arkham Horror and Mansions of Madness represent cult activity through card effects and scenario objectives, abstracting worship into mechanical threats that players must counter through investigation and resource management. Arkham Horror's cult encounters force players to make choices, allow ritual to proceed, increasing doom track toward entity awakening, or intervene, risking sanity and health. This creates strategic tension between addressing immediate cult threats and managing limited resources, mirroring how Lovecraft's protagonists must balance investigation's necessity against its psychological costs. Mansions of Madness's app-driven gameplay permits branching narratives where cult activities might be genuine cosmic contact or elaborate hoax, with scenarios designed so that evidence supports multiple interpretations until final revelation, preserving ambiguity essential to cosmic horror, even within mechanically transparent gaming framework. Musical interpretations span from reverent atmospheric work to explicit lyrical content, documenting cult practices. Technical Death, metal band Nile's album, Annihilation of the Wicked, 2005, includes Spawn of Wamenti, which employs actual ancient Egyptian religious texts alongside Lovecraftian imagery, creating synthesis of historical cult practices and fictional cosmic worship. The music's complexity, polyrhythmic drumming, dissonant guitar work, multi-layered vocals, mirrors cult theology's resistance to simple comprehension, using musical structure to evoke cognitive dissonance that lyrics describe. Dark ambient artists like Cryochamber's Cthulhu, 2014 collaborative album, create hour-long compositions evoking cult ritual through drone tones, chanted vocalizations, and field recordings of water and stone, producing soundscapes designed for meditative engagement with cosmic horror themes rather than conventional musical enjoyment. Neofolk and martial industrial genres appropriate Lovecraftian cult aesthetics extensively, with bands like Death in June and Blood Axis incorporating imagery of secret societies, forbidden knowledge, and apocalyptic transformation. These musical movements blend historical occultism, fascist aesthetics, and cosmic horror into disturbing synthesis that demonstrates how Lovecraft's cult framework can be weaponized for reactionary politics. The very synthesis Lovecraft himself might have approved given his own troubling political sympathies. This appropriation reveals cosmic horror's ethical ambiguity. Frameworks for exploring human vulnerability to totalizing ideologies can themselves become totalizing ideologies. Making critical engagement with Lovecraftian cults require constant vigilance against reproducing rather than analyzing the authoritarian structures they depict. The persistent absence of suppressed cult in adaptations across all media suggests either that certain practices remain too transgressive for representation or that the suppression itself constitutes the point. No film depicts the explicitly sexual cult rituals that Lovecraft's hybrid breeding programs logically require. No game mechanizes the complete psychological dissolution that full cosmic awareness should produce. No musical work captures the genuine horror of worship that achieves nothing except worshippers' annihilation. These absences might reflect commercial and ethical constraints. Audiences have limits beyond which horror becomes exploitation or nihilism becomes unbearable, or might indicate that some implications of Lovecraft's cult logic cannot be represented without destroying the frameworks permitting representation. The suppressed cult exists in negative space, defined by what adaptations systematically avoid depicting, suggesting boundaries that even media explicitly dedicated to transgressive content recognize as counterproductive to cross. Academic study of Lovecraft's fictional cults as commentary on real religious movements has achieved remarkable sophistication, with scholars in comparative religion, sociology, and new religious movement studies analyzing how cosmic horror's cult structures illuminate actual devotional dynamics. Religious studies, Professor Joseph Laycock's work examines how Lovecraft's cults demonstrate mechanisms through which marginalized populations create alternative meaning systems, noting that economic desperation driving Innsmouth toward Deep One worship parallels how actual fringe religions often emerge among socially and economically disenfranchised communities. His analysis treats fictional cults as thought experiments, revealing religious behavior's underlying patterns, the need for belonging, desire for cosmic significance, willingness to accept material benefits despite spiritual costs, that operate identically whether entities worshipped are metaphysically real or psychologically constructed. This academic legitimization transforms pulp horror into serious sociological data, suggesting that Lovecraft accidentally created comprehensive models for understanding religious extremism, despite intending merely to generate atmospheric dread. New religious movement scholarship finds Lovecraft's cults particularly valuable for analyzing how contemporary spiritual organizations form around explicitly fictional frameworks while generating sincere devotional communities. The actual esoteric order of Dagon, various Cthulhu worshipping groups, and chaos magic practitioners employing mythos entities all demonstrate that metaphysical reality claims prove less essential to religious function than organizational structure, ritual practice, and community formation. Scholars like Christopher Partridge in The Re-Enchantment of the West position these groups within broader pattern of occulture, spiritual seeking that draws eclectically from fiction, historical traditions, and personal gnosis without requiring traditional theological commitments. Lovecraft's cults provide ready-made organizational templates that these movements adopt, adapt, and sincerely practice, demonstrating that fictional religions can achieve functional reality through sustained engagement, regardless of participants' metaphysical commitments about entities' objective existence. Gothic and horror subcultures incorporate Lovecraftian cult aesthetics into fashion, music, and identity performance, with tentacles, non-Euclidean geometries, and occult symbols appearing on clothing, jewelry, and body modifications. Hot Topic sells Cthulhu merchandise alongside conventional goth paraphernalia, making cosmic horror imagery accessible to mainstream alternative fashion consumers. This commercialization simultaneously domesticates and disseminates cult aesthetics. The esoteric order of Dagon's symbol becomes fashion statement divorced from theological implications, yet widespread circulation ensures that Lovecraft's religious frameworks remain culturally visible. The subcultural appropriation proves double-edged. It reduces cosmic horror to consumable style, transforming genuinely disturbing cult structures into mere aesthetics, while simultaneously keeping Lovecraft's vocabulary circulating in ways that introduce new audiences to source material's more philosophically sophisticated treatments of devotional corruption and meaning's fragility. The satanic panic of the 1980s-1990s demonstrated how Lovecraftian cult imagery could be conflated with actual moral panic about occult practices, creating a situation where fictional and real cult anxieties became indistinguishable in public discourse. Allegations of ritual satanic abuse frequently incorporated elements resembling Lovecraft's descriptions: secret underground chambers, breeding programs, producing children for sacrifice, multi-generational conspiracies, maintaining hidden traditions. These claims proved almost entirely fabricated, yet their structure mirrored Lovecraftian cult narratives closely enough that some investigators apparently couldn't distinguish between pulp fiction tropes and plausible criminal activity. This episode reveals how Lovecraft's cult frameworks tap into genuine anxieties about secret organizations harming children and maintaining power through concealment, anxieties that persist independently of whether actual satanic cults exist. The fictional cults thus function as cultural templates that actual moral panics employ when constructing narratives about hidden threats, demonstrating cosmic horror's power to shape how communities imagine and respond to perceived dangers. Internet occultism's use of Lovecraftian cult structures as organizational templates demonstrates how fiction provides blueprints for actual spiritual communities. Online groups adapting the starry wisdom sect's hierarchical structure, the esoteric order of Dagon's ritual calendar, or various mythos cults' initiation sequences create functioning religious organizations whose operations follow Lovecraft's descriptions with remarkable fidelity, despite participants knowing these descriptions originated in pulp magazines. Discord servers host virtual cult meetings employing liturgies derived from the Call of Cthulhu and the Shadow over Innsmouth. Members progress through initiation degrees based on knowledge acquisition about cosmic horror lore, and some groups conduct in-person gatherings at Lovecraft-significant locations. This represents religious innovation where acknowledged fiction becomes sincere practice, participants arguing that structural effectiveness matters more than historical authenticity, and that Lovecraft's cults, whether intentionally or not, captured something true about how devotional communities form and operate. The QAnon phenomenon's structural parallels to Lovecraftian cults reveal disturbing ways that cosmic horror's frameworks illuminate actual contemporary conspiracy movements. Both involve secret knowledge accessible only to initiates, graduated revelation where deeper truths await those who prove commitment, global conspiracies coordinating through hidden communication channels, and apocalyptic beliefs that the storm, QAnon, or the return, Cthulhu cults, will vindicate believers and destroy corrupt existing order. Both position adherents as possessing superior understanding that mainstream society dismisses as insanity, making external criticism actually validate internal belief that truth is being suppressed. Both promise that patient faith will be rewarded when cosmic political conditions align correctly. The parallel suggests that Lovecraft's cult structures developed to generate horror through depicting destructive devotional systems, accidentally created accurate models for how actual extremist movements recruit, retain, and radicalize members through precisely the mechanisms cosmic horror intended as cautionary nightmare. Academic debates about ethical engagement with Lovecraft's cult depictions center on whether analyzing structures inherently contaminated by racism and xenophobia risks normalizing the prejudices embedded in their construction. Lovecraft's cults consistently associate non-white, non-Western, and economically marginalized populations with cosmic corruption, making cult membership correlate with deviation from Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms. Scholars disagree about whether this framework can be separated from its creator's bigotry. Some argue that cult structures illuminate genuine religious dynamics regardless of Lovecraft's prejudices, while others insist that the racism isn't incidental but fundamental to how the cults function narratively and philosophically. Contemporary reinterpretations by writers like Victor Laval and Ruth Anna Emrys demonstrate that Lovecraft's cult frameworks can be employed to critique rather than reinforce prejudice, centering marginalized perspectives and revealing how cosmic indifference should undermine all human hierarchies, including racial ones. But tension persists between finding Lovecraft's cult analyses useful and acknowledging that their usefulness emerges from deeply problematic source material requiring constant critical vigilance to prevent reproducing the very prejudices that studying them should expose. The suppressed cult's significance in subcultural and academic appropriations exists through absence that different communities interpret according to their commitments and anxieties. Academics might frame it as representing Lovecraft's most explicit racism, content so virulent that even he recognized it as unpublishable. Occultists might interpret it as genuine cosmic knowledge that even fictional framework couldn't safely convey, practices requiring suppression because articulation would produce catastrophic results. Conspiracy theorists might fantasize it confirms their beliefs about hidden truths deliberately concealed from public. Each interpretation reveals more about interpreters than about actual suppressed content, demonstrating how absence functions more productively than presence could. The unknown cult generates more cultural work than any specific revelation would achieve, serving as screen onto which different communities project their particular anxieties about forbidden knowledge, transgression's limits, and what truths prove too dangerous for articulation, even in fiction explicitly designed to explore dangerous truths. Lovecraftian cults resonate in contemporary consciousness, not despite, but because of proliferating conspiracy theories and alternative fact ecosystems that structurally mirror cosmic horror's religious organizations. Both involve initiated communities possessing secret knowledge that mainstream society dismisses. Both employ graduated revelation, where deeper truths await those proving sufficient commitment. Both position external skepticism as validating evidence that truth is being suppressed by powerful forces. QAnon adherents waiting for the storm, parallel Cthulhu cultists awaiting stellar alignment. Both groups maintained faith despite repeated predictive failures. Both interpret delays as testing devotion rather than falsifying theology. Both promise apocalyptic transformation, vindicating believers and destroying corrupt existing order. This structural parallel suggests that Lovecraft's cults, intended as horror fiction depicting destructive devotional systems, accidentally created accurate models for how actual extremist movements recruit, radicalize, and retain members through precisely the mechanisms cosmic horror meant as cautionary nightmare. The cult's persistence in cultural imagination reflects not nostalgia for pulp-era aesthetics, but disturbing recognition that their organizational logic describes real contemporary phenomena. The appeal of secret knowledge in information-saturated society creates paradoxical situation where abundance of available data generates hunger for hidden truths supposedly concealed beneath surface information. Digital age provides unprecedented access to knowledge. Any factual question can be answered within seconds through internet search. Yet conspiracy theories proliferate faster than ever, suggesting that information abundance creates rather than eliminates appetite for secret wisdom. Lovecraft's cults offer framework for understanding this paradox. They promise not more information, but different epistemological framework, not additional data, but entirely alternative interpretation of existing evidence. The cultists don't know more facts than non-cultists. They possess interpretive schema, revealing patterns that conventional frameworks obscure. This mirrors how conspiracy communities operate. They work with same publicly available information as mainstream sources, but employ alternative hermeneutics, producing radically different conclusions. The cult structure thus addresses persistent human need to feel that surface reality conceals deeper truth, that those perceiving correctly possess advantage over those accepting official narratives, that initiation into secret knowledge provides power unavailable to uninitiated masses. Cults, as metaphor for ideological capture and radicalization, illuminate how individuals transition from curious inquiry to totalist commitment through graduated processes that appear voluntary, but exploit psychological vulnerabilities, making retreat progressively impossible. The Deep One hybrid's transformation, appearing voluntary initially, Captain Marsh negotiated the bargain, but becoming biological inevitability for descendants, mirrors how ideological radicalization operates through sunk cost reasoning and identity fusion. Initial engagement seems harmless. Curiosity about alternative perspectives, willingness to consider unconventional ideas, but accumulated investment, time spent in community, relationships formed with fellow believers, public statements supporting ideology, creates psychological barriers to departure. Eventually, the ideology becomes inseparable from identity, making apostasy require rejecting not just beliefs, but selfhood constructed around those beliefs. Lovecraft's cults make this process literal through biological transformation, but the psychological mechanisms operate identically in actual radicalization. You become what you worship, whether transformation manifests physically or purely through consciousness, restructured by sustained devotional practice. Social media algorithms function as Lovecraftian cult recruitment mechanisms, optimizing for engagement through graduated exposure to increasingly extreme content that users don't consciously choose, but that platforms' recommendation systems strategically provide. YouTube's autoplay feature, Facebook's content suggestions, Twitter's trending topics, all employ algorithmic logic, determining what users see based on maximizing watch time, clicks, and sustained platform engagement. These systems demonstrably create radicalization pipelines where casual interest in topic leads through progressively more extreme content toward conspiracy theories, extremist ideologies, or cultic communities. The user experiences this as voluntary exploration, autonomous choices about what to consume, but the algorithmic curation invisibly shapes those choices toward outcomes that benefit platform metrics, regardless of user welfare. This mirrors how Lovecraft's cults operate. Initiates feel they're voluntarily pursuing knowledge, making autonomous decisions about deepening involvement, while cult structure strategically manages information exposure and social reinforcement to ensure that voluntary progression follows predetermined path toward outcomes that serve cults' interests rather than individuals' well-being. The psychology of worshipping the indifferent reveals persistent human need for cosmic significance, even when that significance involves being destroyed by forces vastly more powerful than humanity. Lovecraft's cultists' direct devotion toward entities incapable of reciprocating, maintaining faith despite receiving no divine love, no salvation, no acknowledgement of their existence. This appears irrational until recognizing that worshipping indifferent cosmos still grants worshippers meaning. They matter enough to be destroyed by cosmic forces rather than simply ceasing to exist through random thermodynamic processes. The cultist who transforms into Deep One, who goes mad from cosmic knowledge, who gets eliminated when great old ones return. All these fates, however horrifying, represent participation in cosmic narrative, larger than individual human life. Better to be tentacle fodder for Cthulhu than to live and die without cosmic significance whatsoever. This psychological dynamic illuminates why people join destructive movements generally. Total institutions demanding complete sacrifice at least provide certainty, meaning, and belonging that atomized modern existence often withholds, making even doom preferable to purposeless survival. Climate, catastrophe, and apocalypse. Preparation demonstrate how Lovecraftian waiting for inevitable catastrophe describes actual contemporary stance toward planetary scale threats that knowledge cannot prevent. The Cthulhu cults don't worship to prevent the great old one's return, but to prepare for guaranteed event when astronomical conditions permit manifestation that human civilization cannot survive. Climate activists occupy similar position, possessing knowledge about approaching catastrophe, understanding that current political and economic systems won't implement changes preventing worst outcomes, and choosing between denial, psychologically comfortable but factually wrong, or acceptance, factually accurate but psychologically devastating. The cult structure provides third option: acknowledge inevitable disaster while positioning yourself to survive, or at least understand what's happening, maintaining agency through preparation even when prevention proves impossible. Preppers stockpiling supplies, communities developing resilience strategies, and individuals cultivating psychological frameworks for accepting civilizational decline, All employ cult-like logic. They cannot stop the catastrophe, but can control their relationship to it, making worship of inevitable doom paradoxically empowering through acknowledging powerlessness. Corporate culture as cult structure reveals how total institutions demanding identity transformation in exchange for material benefits operate identically, whether worshipping cosmic entities or pursuing quarterly profits. Tech companies offering comprehensive benefits, healthcare, meals, gyms, social activities, while expecting employees to center lives around work, recreate cult dynamics. Material needs get met, while personal identity progressively merges with organizational identity until distinguishing employee from company becomes difficult. The Deep One transformation offers biological metaphor for this process. You start appearing human, but working for the organization, gradually transform through sustained exposure to corporate culture, eventually abandon terrestrial existence, life outside work, to dwell entirely in organizational spaces, working remotely from company housing, socializing exclusively with colleagues, defining selfhood through professional role. The parallel isn't metaphorical, but structural. Both involve trading autonomy for security, accepting progressive identity dissolution in exchange for material comfort, and discovering that the bargain proves irreversible once transformation advances sufficiently far. The cultist's choice between complicity and resistance when facing cosmic inevitability articulates a philosophical problem with no satisfactory resolution. If cosmic entities will return regardless of human action, if transformation is genetically written into hybrid biology, if knowledge once acquired cannot be unlearned, then what constitutes meaningful resistance? Lovecraft's protagonists typically choose flight. Robert Olmsted fleeing Innsmouth before accepting his destiny, or futile opposition. Professor Armitage banishing the Dunwich horror temporarily but not permanently, or investigative documentation. Thurston assembling evidence about Cthulhu cults while fearing he'll share his uncle's fate. None of these responses prevent cosmic horror's ultimate victory. They merely determine how individuals relate to inevitable outcome. Contemporary audiences facing similarly intractable problems, climate change, nuclear proliferation, AI development, pandemic risk, occupy equivalent position. Knowledge reveals threats that cannot be eliminated through individual action, yet passivity feels like complicity, while resistance feels futile. The cult framework offers no solution, but provides vocabulary for articulating the dilemma. We are all cultists now, worshipping forces we cannot control, watching inevitable catastrophes approach, choosing only whether to acknowledge what we cannot prevent. Why we find cults compelling reveals dangerous allure of certainty and belonging in uncertain, atomized world where traditional meaning-making structures have collapsed without adequate replacements. Lovecraft's cults offer what modernity withholds: absolute conviction about cosmic truth, community of shared belief, transcending individual doubt, hierarchical structure providing clear advancement path and defined social roles, and purpose that extends beyond individual lifespan to cosmic timescales. That the purpose involves doom and the truth destroys sanity seems almost incidental. The structural comforts of total institutions prove so psychologically powerful that even obviously destructive organizations attract members willing to sacrifice autonomy for certainty. This explains both fictional cults' narrative persistence and actual cults' recruitment success. They address genuine human needs that liberal individualism and scientific uncertainty cannot satisfy, making their appeal comprehensible even when their outcomes prove catastrophic. The final unresolved questions accumulate. Are Lovecraft's cults warnings about religious extremism's dangers, or demonstrations that religious impulse represents human, universal, that even materialist atheist must acknowledge? Do they critique belief or reveal belief's psychological necessity, regardless of metaphysical validity? What does it mean that people actually formed cults based on entities they know are fictional? Is this playful postmodern spirituality or genuine religious innovation? And what worship practices remained too transgressive, even for Lovecraft to describe? The sexual, the violent, the philosophically nihilistic. And what does that suppression reveal about cosmic horror's ethical boundaries? Most disturbingly, if Lovecraft's cults accurately model how actual extremist movements recruit and radicalize members, if their structures describe real contemporary phenomena, from QAnon to corporate culture to algorithmic radicalization pipelines, then are we living in cosmic horror's cult-saturated universe, not because tentacle gods exist, but because the social, psychological, and technological conditions Lovecraft explored through supernatural fiction now manifest through entirely natural mechanisms that prove equally inescapable, equally destructive, and equally resistant to individual resistance. The cults persist not as nostalgia for pulp horror, but as recognition that their logic describes actual conditions of contemporary existence, where meaning requires submission to forces larger than ourselves, where belonging demands identity transformation, and where the only choices involve which inevitable doom to worship, and whether worship provides meaning sufficient to justify the annihilation it guarantees.